Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you fall asleep. So, before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so leave it in the comments. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. My name is Martin. What I'm about to tell you is not to justify myself or to make you feel sorry for me. It is just the truth of what happened in a place that no longer exists, among people who are no longer there. I grew up in a village on the edge of a river, a beautiful place where the green of the mountains met the blue of the sky. We were poor, but happy. I never thought the war would catch up with us, but it did, like a storm that sweeps everything away. I was 19 years old when the first rumors of conflict came from the region. Armed groups were looting villages and forcibly recruiting young people. At the time, I was living with my mother and my younger brother, Julian. My father had died a few years earlier, and since then I had tried to fill the void by taking care of my family. I thought that if we kept a low profile, we could survive. But war is no respecter of the silent. One rainy afternoon, while collecting firewood with Julian, we saw plumes of smoke rising from the center of the village. We dropped the load and ran as fast as we could. The scene was chaos. Houses on fire, people running and screaming, armed men pointing their rifles at anyone who tried to resist. My mother came out of our house with a face pale with terror. She saw us, but couldn't get close before she was caught. The men soon found us too. They hit me with the butt of a gun, and everything became a blur. When I woke up, I was tied up with other young men. They told us that we were now part of their army, that we had to fight for them or die. Julian, who was barely 14 years old, was taken away along with other children. My chest tightened as I saw his terrified look. I silently promised that I would do my best to protect him. We were taken to a camp in the mountains, a place so wet and cold that it seemed like the end of the world. The training was brutal. We were taught to shoot, to handle explosives, to kill without hesitation. Julian and I were forced to perform different tasks, and although I tried to take care of him, there were times when I could not see him for days. His absence filled me with unbearable anxiety, but every time I found him, his gaze reminded me to stay strong for both of us. Weeks turned into months. Every day was a struggle to survive, not only against the enemy, but against the very men who claimed to be our allies. Hunger, exhaustion, and constant fear transformed me into someone I barely recognized. However, Julian remained my only reason to resist. In spite of everything, his face held a spark of hope that forced me not to give up. One day, we received the order to attack a nearby village. My heart sank when I heard the name. It was the place where I had grown up, the home that had been taken from me. We were told that there were enemy soldiers hiding there, and that we were to eliminate them. I was forced to lead a small group, and though I tried to refuse, a rifle pointed at my head convinced me otherwise. When we arrived, the rain was pouring down relentlessly, turning the ground into a quagmire. I recognized the streets and houses, though many were in ruins. We entered cautiously, checking every nook and cranny. It was then that I heard a familiar sound. A voice, barely a whisper, but it chilled my blood. It was my mother. She was hiding in a half-collapsed house next to a group of villagers. I wanted to run and hug her, but they stopped me. They ordered me to give them the signal to shoot. At that instant, I knew I couldn't go on like that. I could not be part of this madness. In desperation, I shouted out that there were enemy soldiers in another direction and asked them to go investigate. As they drove away, I ran into the house and found my mother. She was thin, her face marked by suffering, but alive. I told her that she should escape with the others, that they should seek shelter away from the mountains. I tried to explain to her what had happened, but there was no time for details. As I helped her out, I heard a scream behind me. One of the men had returned and had seen us. He pointed his gun at me, but on impulse, I managed to knock him down and grab his rifle. It was the first time I had killed someone face to face. I felt his last breath as he fell to the ground, and I knew there was no turning back. I ran with my mother and the others into the woods. The rain covered us, making it difficult for them to follow us. For hours, we advanced aimlessly, driven only by the instinct to survive. Finally, we arrived at a small, abandoned shelter. There I convinced my mother to stay while I went back for Julian. I could not leave him behind. When I returned to the camp, I found a different picture. The tension was palpable, and the men seemed nervous. I discovered that they had captured Julian, accusing him of trying to escape. They had tied him to a post in the center of the camp and planned to execute him at dawn as a warning to the others. Desperation took hold of me. I knew I didn't have much time. That night, under the cover of the storm, I slipped between the tents and cut the ropes that bound Julian. He was weak, but when he saw me, his eyes lit up with a spark of hope that almost brought tears to my eyes. I carried him on my shoulders, and we slipped away into the forest. The rain was heavy, and thunder covered our steps. We ran until our legs could take no more. Finally, we reached the shelter where our mother was. The joy on her face at seeing us together was indescribable, but also fleeting. We knew we were not safe yet. It was several days before we found a group of soldiers patrolling the area. We surrendered to them, hoping they could protect us. They took us to a military camp, where we received food and medical attention. For the first time in months, I felt we might have a chance to start over. Today, as I recount this from a place of safety, I still feel the weight of everything we went through. The war changed us forever. We lost our village, our friends, our innocence. But we are still here, together, and that is all that matters. I don't know if I will ever be able to leave behind the sights and sounds of those days, but every time I look at my brother and my mother, I remember that hope is the last thing that the war could not take away from us. My name is Jeans, and a few years ago I lived an experience that still haunts me, one that I can't quite understand. My mind is still trapped in memories, especially when the sky is covered with dark clouds and the rain begins to fall. It all started with a promise I made to two of my closest friends, Gonzalo and Jeremias. The three of us shared an insatiable curiosity for the unknown, and on a rainy autumn afternoon, they convinced me to go explore an old orphanage that had been closed for more than 3 decades. The orphanage was located on the outskirts of town, at the end of a forgotten road, surrounded by tall trees that barely let in any sunlight. It was said to have been abruptly abandoned after a series of strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances, rumors of shadows creeping through the corridors, and voices of children who were never found. We were captivated by the idea of discovering what had happened there, not knowing that night would change our lives forever. The storm began as we approached the hill where the orphanage was located. The wind was blowing hard and the rain was hitting the windshield with such intensity that we could hardly see beyond a few meters. Gonzalo, who was always the bravest of the three of us, decided that we would continue, and I, although restless, could not stay behind. Jeremiah, for his part, only laughed nervously, as if trying to relieve the tension in the air. Upon arrival, the building greeted us with a shadowy silhouette. It was a large 3-story structure, built of red bricks that already looked worn by the passage of time. The windows were broken, and the curtains swayed in the wind, as if the orphanage was alive. A strange feeling came over me as we entered, as if an invisible force was watching us from the shadows. The door, which was ajar, creaked as we pushed it, and the sound of rain on the roof echoed in every corner. We walked the corridors carefully. The lights flickered, and the air was heavy with humidity. Somehow, the place was almost untouched, as if the children who had lived there had left for some unknown reason, leaving their crumbling world behind. Childish drawings covered the walls, along with words written in chalk that faded with time, but still managed to convey a sense of life, that someone had been there very recently. Jeremiah, ever the curious one, began to explore further, while Gonzalo and I walked down the hallway, unsettled by the eerie silence. It was then that we heard the first thing, a soft sound, like a whisper. At first I thought it was the wind seeping through the cracks in the building, but the sound was repeated, this time clearer, as if someone was whispering something from the shadows. I looked at Gonzalo, and he had heard it too. His eyes widened as we looked at each other, searching for answers we knew we would not find. We went up to the second floor, where the silence deepened. The sound of the rain was now a distant murmur, and the air was heavy with a sense of oppression. We entered a large room, which had once been a dining room or recreation space. There were broken toys on the floor, dolls with broken eyes and torn clothes. But most disturbing was the feeling that something or someone was still there, waiting. Suddenly we heard a rustling sound coming from a room in the back. Jeremiah had entered without our noticing. We decided to follow him, but when we reached the door, everything stopped. Absolute silence enveloped the room, and the only thing we could hear was the rapid beating of our hearts. Gonzalo pushed the door cautiously, and as he opened it, a figure appeared on the threshold, a shadowy silhouette that vanished into thin air like a shadow that was never there. The next thing happened so fast that I could not comprehend it until afterwards. A piercing scream, the sound of something heavy dragging on the floor, and then emptiness. Jeremiah was gone. We hurried to look for him, calling his name in the darkness, but the only response was the echo of our voices. We ran back and forth, searching desperately, but the place seemed to have turned into a labyrinth. Walls were closing in, doors were leading us into corridors we had never seen before. The rain outside had intensified, and the drops were hitting the windows with such force that it was as if the orphanage wanted to swallow us up. I decided to go back to the second floor, thinking that maybe Jeremiah had managed to escape without us noticing. But when I got there, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing at the second floor window, silently watching us. It was not Jeremias. It was not Gonzalo. It was a shadow, tall, thin, with a presence that seemed to have materialized out of nowhere. It stared, without moving, as if it was waiting for us. We ran towards the exit, but the storm did not allow us to see anything. The wind and rain pounded us, but we didn't stop. We reached the car, and when I looked toward the orphanage for the last time, the figure was still there, at the window, watching. I never saw Gonzalo or Jeremias again. After that night, their phones were turned off. No one saw them again, and although the police investigated, they never found any clues that could explain it. For me, everything became clear that night in the storm. The orphanage had claimed my friends, and their fate was now part of that forgotten place, a place where shadows still move, waiting. What happened that night remains a mystery, but whenever I hear the sound of the rain hitting the windows, I wonder if, somehow, they are still trapped there, watching from the shadows. My name is Martin, and if someone had told me years ago that I would end up writing about this, I probably would have laughed. Now, sitting in front of my desk in a locked room, with paranoia still lurking in the darkest corners of my mind, I know this is not a story to laugh about. This is the story of how I almost lost everything, my identity, my life, and my freedom, at the hands of a group hiding behind the facade of a supposed path to enlightenment. It all started when I was going through one of the lowest moments of my life. My relationship of years had ended abruptly. I had lost my mother a few months earlier, and my work as a freelance photographer was barely keeping me afloat. I was looking for answers, something to make sense of all the chaos. That's when a friend, Gustavo, told me about a spiritual retreat that had just changed his life. He described it as a space to find peace and purpose, led by a man they only called the Guide. At first, I was skeptical, but Gustavo insisted. He told me that after the retreat he had found clarity, purpose, and a family in the group. His enthusiasm was contagious, and I finally agreed to accompany him to the next meeting. In retrospect, that was the first step into an abyss I never saw coming. The retreat was held on a remote farm, deep in a dense and silent forest. The place had an eerie air about it, but everyone in attendance seemed warm and welcoming. We were greeted with smiles and kind words. Heriberto, the coordinator, was in charge of overseeing the activities and making sure we were all comfortable. I felt relieved at first, as if I had found a place where I could leave my worries behind. The first day was simple: breathing exercises, talks about spiritual connection and group dynamics to share our emotions. Everyone seemed open and vulnerable, something that initially struck me as genuine. At the end of the day, we gathered around a campfire while the guide spoke. He was a middle-aged man with a magnetic presence. His words were powerful, and his penetrating gaze seemed to pierce through any barrier one might try to put up. His speech centered on the idea that modern society was broken, that we were all tainted by ego, and that the only way to find true freedom was to give ourselves completely to the community. At first, what he was saying made sense. He was talking about letting go of the burdens of the past, building a more just world, and finding a collective purpose. But I soon noticed that there was an underlying tone that didn't quite fit. He emphasized the need for purification, a process that, he said, required stripping away everything that defined us as individuals, our possessions, our external relationships, and above all, our internal resistance. On the third day, the most intense activities began. We were divided into small groups, and each had a mentor who supervised our tasks. I was assigned to Manuel, a man who seemed kind, but quickly became authoritarian. He subjected us to long sessions of group confessions, where we had to reveal our deepest fears and mistakes. He said it was part of the liberation process, but I felt something was wrong when the confessions of some of our companions were then used as examples of what we should not be. The pressure increased when they started to reduce our sleeping hours and the amount of food. They said that hunger and tiredness were ways to break down our internal barriers. I remember one night in particular, when they made us walk barefoot through the forest in complete darkness, guided only by the instructions of our mentors. At first, I thought it was an exercise in trust, but I soon realized that it was an act of submission. My friendship with Gustavo began to deteriorate. He seemed completely devoted to the group, defending each of his practices as necessary for our transformation. Every time he expressed doubts, he would tell me that it was my ego resisting change. I felt I was losing him, that he was no longer the same person I knew. The breaking point came during the last night of the retreat. We were taken to a clearing in the forest, where the guide waited for us, surrounded by torches. He said it was time to take the final step towards enlightenment, which required an act of total surrender. He asked us to sign a document that he said was a symbolic pact to leave our old lives behind. At that moment, my instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. I tried to refuse, but Heriberto and Manuel approached me, their smiles gone, replaced by stern looks. They told me it was normal to be afraid, that resistance was part of the process, but that I should trust them. When I refused again, their tone changed. They warned me that I would not break with the group without consequences. The words were veiled, but the threat was clear. That night, while the others slept, I made the decision to escape. I knew I could not stay there any longer. I waited until all was quiet and left the cabin. I walked through the forest, guided by the faint moonlight. My heart was pounding, and every creak of the branches under my feet made me fear that someone was following me. I made it to the main road at dawn. A car stopped, and the driver, seeing me soaked and exhausted, agreed to take me to the nearest town. The next day, I went straight to the police. At first, they doubted my story, but after investigating, they discovered that the group had a dark history. It was not the first time someone had tried to escape from them. Gustavo never returned my calls. The following months were a struggle to get my life back, to leave behind the psychological manipulation and constant fear. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had signed that document, if I had completely given in to his control. Now I know that the real terror is not in the supernatural, but in the ability of humans to destroy others in the name of a cause. I cannot pinpoint the exact moment when my life began to fracture, but I know that the break was so deep that I could never repair it. For years I led an existence that could be defined as ordinary: a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, a steady job, and a routine that flowed like a slow river. But beneath that apparent normality, there was something that consumed me, a secret that whispered in my mind even in the quietest moments. It all began one cold, rainy night, more than a decade ago when I was 22 years old. I was a college student full of promise, but also of awkwardness and bad decisions. That night, I had gone out with Diego and Marco, two childhood friends. After a few beers at a bar near campus, Diego suggested going to the old road through the woods, a place we used to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. I was behind the wheel. I had been drinking, not enough to be drunk, but enough to cloud my judgment. The road was dark and deserted, and our laughter filled the car. I don't remember the exact moment it happened. A lump suddenly appeared on the road. I slammed on my brakes, but it was too late. A thud, and everything went silent. We got out of the car, the three of us. On the ground there was a man lying motionless. He was young, probably our age. He didn't speak, he didn't move. Diego shouted that we should leave, that no one had seen us, that we could blame fate or anything else. And in the midst of fear and confusion, I did the wrong thing. I got in the car, backed up, and fled. That night was the beginning of the end. At first, paranoia consumed me. Every time I heard a siren, I thought they were coming for me. I avoided the local news for months, unable to face the possibility that the accident had come to light. But the days passed, and all remained silent. On the outside, I went on with my life. On the inside, something snapped, and it was never the same. I graduated, moved away, and stopped talking to Diego and Marco. I buried that night so deeply that I was almost convinced it had been a bad dream. Then I met Valeria. She was unlike anyone I had ever met before. Vivacious, compassionate, full of light. We fell in love fast, and for a while I thought maybe I could redeem myself by being the man she deserved. We married in a bright summer and built a life together, simple but happy. However, even in the most blissful moments, something dark remained with me. Valeria never suspected anything, but I knew I could not escape my own reflection. Some nights I would wake up sweating, with the face of that man in my dreams, looking at me with glassy eyes. One afternoon, 12 years after the accident, I received an envelope with no return address. When I opened it, my blood froze. Inside was a picture, the face of that man lying on the road, but in this picture, he was in a wheelchair. Next to the picture, a few words written in black ink. I know what you did. I'll be waiting for you tomorrow at 9 p.m. at the Monteverde Cafe. The panic was immediate. Had he survived? Had he spent all this time looking for me? The guilt, which had been dormant for years, returned with unbearable intensity. For hours, I debated whether to go to him or ignore him. But curiosity, fear, and the weight of guilt drove me to the cafe the next day. The place was nearly empty except for a man in a suit sitting at a table by the window. He was not who I expected to see. He explained to me that he represented Emiliano, the young man I had run over that night. Emiliano had become a paraplegic, and his life had become a constant struggle with pain, frustration, and dependency. The lawyer looked at me with a coldness that chilled me. Emiliano has waited a long time to find you, he said. He's not seeking revenge, but his recovery and care have been costly. We want you to pay, literally. Fair compensation, 10 million pesos. The air seemed to disappear from my lungs. It was an impossible figure for me. I barely had any savings, and even if I sold everything I owned, it wouldn't be enough. I tried to explain, but the man just shrugged. If you can't pay, we'll sue you. Emiliano deserves justice. I returned home like a walking corpse. I knew I had no escape. I tried to seek help, but even Valeria, upon hearing what had happened, looked at me as if she didn't recognize me. "How could you?" was all she said before she left. The lawsuit came weeks later, and with it, my world came crashing down. During the trial, Emiliano appeared in his wheelchair. He didn't look directly at me, but his presence was like an unbearable weight. He recounted how his life had changed that night, his dashed dreams, the lost opportunities, the physical and emotional pain that accompanied him day after day. The sentence was blunt. Not only was I sentenced to pay $1 million compensation that I would never be able to collect, but also to several years in prison for abandonment of the scene. Now I write these words from my cell. The silence here is deafening, but also brutally revealing. In this place, I cannot escape my thoughts, the decisions that brought me here. Every night I see Emiliano in my mind, not as the young man on the road, but as the man my cowardice condemned to a life of suffering. The punishment meted out by justice is just, but it is not my true torment. My greatest condemnation is knowing that, in my fear and selfishness, I destroyed not only my life, but someone else's as well. Here in this cell, guilt is my constant companion, and the reflection in the mirror reminds me that the real monster was always inside me. Life sometimes has a way of surprising you with what you least expect. That's what happened when I met Javier. He was not a particularly interesting man or someone you would expect to find in a story like this. He was, at least on the surface, just another stranger passing through life without leaving much of a trace. However, it all began on a rainy night, several years ago now, when my daily routine was disrupted in the most terrifying way possible. My name is Lucas, and I was working as a graphic designer in a small advertising agency. My days were monotonous, but I preferred it that way. I didn't like chaos and uncertainty. I lived alone, far from my family, but I didn't feel particularly lonely. Somehow, I had learned to be okay with myself and my own company. My friends were few, but enough to keep me from feeling disconnected from life. One November afternoon, as I was walking home after a long day at work, something happened that I will never forget. Rain had begun to fall unexpectedly, soaking the sidewalks and making the air thick and cold. As I made my way down the street, I saw a man standing on a corner. He wasn't doing anything in particular, just staring into nothingness, as if he was waiting for someone or waiting for the world to pass in front of him. His presence was strange to me, but I didn't pay much attention to him. I was used to seeing people on the street at that hour, and the rain was not inviting more interaction than already existed between passers-by. The man was not particularly tall, but his thin figure and somber face caught my attention. He had a vacant look on his face, an expression I couldn't quite describe. He didn't seem to be concerned about the rain soaking him, or the fact that people were passing quickly around him. Something about his attitude made me uncomfortable, but I couldn't explain it at the time. I walked past him, trying not to look too much, but something inside me told me I should look a little closer. A few steps ahead, a strange feeling came over me. I turned slowly and saw him following me at a distance, unhurriedly, without making a sound. Instead of panicking, the discomfort increased. This stranger, who until that moment had done nothing to frighten me, was somehow stalking me. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks due to fatigue or the darkness of the night. I decided to pick up the pace. I turned the corner and walked into the brightly lit street where the city lights provided some reassurance. However, as I reached my door, I realized that the man had not disappeared. He was a few meters from my house, standing there, as if he had no intention of moving. I rushed into my apartment, closing the door behind me. My heart was pounding, but I tried to calm down. My head was trying to rationalize what had just happened. After all, maybe he had simply been walking around the area and my footsteps had coincidentally led him there. I had no reason to think I was being chased, did I? That night I had a hard time sleeping. I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the street, his empty eyes, his inexplicable presence. Something told me I shouldn't ignore him. Nevertheless, I did. I thought maybe it was just a coincidence. Days passed, and although the uneasy feeling did not disappear completely, I tried to go on with my life. I started going out to work at the same hours and walking the same streets. But something in the air had changed. Every time I took the same route, I felt watched, and it wasn't just by the man in the rain. It was as if someone was lurking, following me from the shadows. My intuition told me something wasn't right, but I refused to accept the idea that a mere stranger could be altering my life in such a way. I saw him again a week later, in the same place, in the pouring rain. He was there, as if waiting for me. This time, I didn't hesitate for a second. I turned quickly and started walking in the opposite direction, without looking back. However, as I turned the corner, something made me stop. The sound of footsteps behind me was unmistakable. I did not dare to look. My legs were trembling, and a sense of dread gripped my body. I ran without thinking, without once looking back. My breathing quickened, and every time I turned a corner, I had the feeling that the man was following me, that he was right behind me. Finally, I came to a park, where I saw a couple of people in the distance. I felt immediate relief, and for a moment I thought I had escaped. However, as I turned to continue on my way, I saw the same figure in the distance, watching me from the park entrance. That was the last time I saw him in person, but the feeling of being chased never went away. The following weeks were filled with anxiety and paranoia. Every time I left my house, I looked over my shoulder. Every shadow seemed to have a figure watching me, and every noise made me stop in my tracks. I decided to change my route to work, but the feeling of being watched would not go away. The man was always there, somewhere, in some corner of the city. My life began to revolve around that anxiety. I had gone from being a quiet man dedicated to his work to a being who lived in constant fear. I thought I was losing my mind, that I had imagined everything. But deep down, I knew something was wrong, that the man I had seen on the street was no mere coincidence. Finally, one day, while walking down a secluded street, I saw him again. This time, he was close enough to see the details of his face. There was something in his gaze that completely froze me. I recognized that expression. It was the same empty look, devoid of any emotion, that I had seen the first time. At that moment, I understood that I could no longer ignore the truth. I was being stalked by someone dangerous. Without knowing how, I managed to gather the strength to face what was happening. I filed a report with the police, even though I knew they didn't have enough evidence to catch him. For days, I felt time stretched on a tense thread, but the man never reappeared. The police, with the few details I provided, managed to track his movements and discovered that Javier, as the man turned out to be called, had a history of stalking and dangerous behavior. The arrest occurred without further incident. Javier was arrested for attempted harassment and threats, and his story came out. It turned out that he had been following several people, but no one had managed to report him before it was too late. Although the relief of knowing that he was no longer stalking me was immense, the sense of vulnerability and fear of the unknown never completely went away. Years later, I still wonder what my life would have been like had I not made that decision to face my fear and seek help. Perhaps I would have remained trapped in that cycle of paranoia and fear. Maybe Javier would have succeeded in his dark purposes. But what I do know is that my life was forever changed, not only by the man who pursued me, but by learning that, in this world, the threat doesn't always come from what we see with the naked eye. Sometimes the scariest thing is what you refuse to see. When I think back to my childhood, I remember many things fondly. Afternoons playing in the park, the sound of my mother singing as she cooked, and walks with my grandfather in the woods near our house. But there's also something I've never been able to forget, something I buried deep because I simply don't know how to deal with it. Sometimes, childhood memories are not innocent, but dark and heartbreaking. I grew up in a small town that was surrounded by a lush forest. My family lived in an old house that my grandfather had built years ago, near the edge of the forest. As a child, that place was my sanctuary. I could lose myself in the trees for hours, exploring every nook and cranny and looking for little adventures. There was one place in particular that fascinated me, a clearing hidden among the thickest trees. It was hard to find if you didn't know the way. There was an old dilapidated cabin there, with walls eaten away by time and a half-fallen roof. I liked to imagine it was a secret hideaway, a place just mine. One day, while exploring, I found something strange. Near the cabin was a small mound of freshly turned earth, as if someone had dug and reburied something. My childlike curiosity led me to get a stick and dig around a bit. I didn't have to dig very deep before I found a wooden box, locked with a rusty padlock. I couldn't open it, but I took it home. That night, after much effort, I managed to pick the lock with a screwdriver. Inside the box was a collection of photographs. Most of them were old pictures of people I didn't recognize, but at the bottom of the pile I found something that left me frozen. A picture of me, playing in front of the cabin. I didn't understand how that was possible. I didn't remember seeing anyone else in the woods, ever. My grandfather always said that those trees were ours alone, that no one else ventured that far. But there was proof that someone had been watching me. I told no one what I found. For days, every time I went out into the woods, I felt uneasy, as if I were being watched. The shadows between the trees seemed to move, and the rustling of branches made me look over my shoulder. A couple of weeks later, something happened that I will never forget. It was a gray afternoon, and I had ventured back to the cabin clearing, trying to convince myself that there was nothing to fear. But when I arrived, I noticed something different. The door to the cabin, which had always been closed and overgrown with weeds, was ajar. Curiosity and fear fought inside me, but in the end, curiosity won out. I pushed the door slowly and entered. The interior was dark and dank, with a smell of rotting wood. There was a table in the center of the room, and on it, an object I recognized instantly. The wooden box I had found and brought home. I froze. It made no sense. I had hidden the box under my bed. How had it gotten there? Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me, just outside the cabin. I ran out without looking back, sensing that something or someone was right behind me. When I got home, I tried to explain to my mother what had happened, but she only scolded me for having wandered so far away. That night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard something at the window, a light tapping, as if someone was touching the glass. I looked up in fear, but there was nothing there. The next morning, I found something strange in front of our door, a bouquet of wildflowers, and next to it, a small note that simply said, "Don't come back." After that, I stopped going to the forest, but the night noises continued, knocking on the walls, the creaking of the floor as if someone was walking through the house, and the constant feeling of being watched. One night, as I looked out the window, I could swear I saw a figure in the trees, motionless, watching me. Years passed, and eventually we moved to another place. But the memory of those days never left me. I convinced myself that it had all been a figment of my childish imagination, an attempt to rationalize what I didn't understand. Years later, however, an event rekindled everything as if it had happened yesterday. I had started working in a nearby town, and one day, while checking the local news, I saw a headline that took my breath away. Human remains found in abandoned cabin near San Gregorio Forest. The image accompanying the article was unmistakable. The old cabin from my childhood. According to the report, authorities had found several makeshift graves in the clearing, along with the remains of photographs and personal items of the victims. What was most disturbing was that the remains dated back decades, which meant that someone had been using the place for a long time. But what really kept me awake at night was another detail in the article. They mentioned finding a wooden box with photographs. Among them, a picture of a child in front of the cabin. I don't know what really happened in that forest or who was behind it all. But one thing is for sure. That cabin and what I found there left an indelible mark on me. And even though I try to convince myself that I'm safe, every time I'm alone, I feel as if someone, somewhere, is still watching me. I decided to move to a rural area in search of tranquility. Life in the city was no longer bearable, with its constant bustle, lack of privacy, and a sense of confinement that seemed to grow with each day. I moved into a somewhat small house located at the end of a road in a remote village. It was in the middle of the countryside and there were only a few buildings. It seemed like the perfect place to start over. The nearest house was about 250 meters away. From my window, I could see its sloping, weathered roof. I hardly noticed any movement there for the first few weeks. It was evident that someone lived in the house, for I occasionally saw lights in the windows at night and noticed smoke rising from the chimney on cold mornings. But I never saw anyone enter or leave. The villagers with whom I exchanged words seemed elusive when I mentioned my neighbor. An old man in the local store only muttered that the man preferred to be alone, and that it was best to respect his privacy. It was enough to arouse my curiosity, though I had no intention of intruding. One afternoon, while working in my garden, I noticed something peculiar. A figure was moving among the trees near my house. He was a tall, stoop-shouldered man, dressed in shabby clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that hid his face. He seemed to be inspecting something on the ground, but when he noticed my gaze, he stopped abruptly and disappeared into the trees before I could greet him. That was the first time I felt an awkwardness that I could not explain. From that moment on, things started to get very strange. At night, I would hear rustling outside my house, as if someone was walking around, although every time I checked, I found nothing. Once, I even found small footprints in the mud near my living room window. They seemed too big to be from an animal, but I didn't dare jump to conclusions. As the weeks passed, the man's presence in the neighboring house became more evident. One night, while reading in my living room, I heard the sound of something tapping repeatedly in the distance. I stepped out onto the porch and saw a flickering light in his house, as if someone was working after hours. The sound was constant, a hammering that seemed to echo in the cold air. In the morning, I decided to walk to his property. There was a low fence surrounding the place, and I noticed that the path to his gate was overgrown with weeds, as if no one had used it in years. I got close enough to see that the windows were sealed from the inside with boards. A skinny old dog came out of nowhere, growling. I backed away quickly, realizing that my presence was not welcome. That night, the pounding returned, more intense and with an irregular rhythm. For some reason, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt something was wrong. I went out on the porch again and looked toward his house. The light was still on, but now I noticed a silhouette behind the curtains. Still, motionless, as if watching me. The next few days, I began to find strange things near my house. An old, worn rope hanging from a tree in the woods nearby. A pair of dirty boots left at the foot of my fence, full of dried mud. And finally, one night I found a rag doll, broken and dirty, right outside my door. I could no longer ignore it. Something was going on, and the man in the house at the end of the road was at the center of it all. I decided to investigate further. I headed into town and talked to the old man in the store. This time he was more direct. He's not from around here. He came years ago, bought that house, and hasn't spoken to anyone since. But some say he's not alone, that sometimes you hear more footsteps than should be there. The uneasy feeling grew, but I couldn't give it all up without knowing the truth. That same night, armed with a flashlight, I walked to his property. There was absolute silence. I reached the back door, which was ajar. Inside, the air was permeated with a musty smell, a mixture of humidity and something else I couldn't identify. I turned on my flashlight and moved forward. The house was in disarray, full of old boxes and rusty tools. On the floor, I found strange marks, as if something heavy had been dragged repeatedly. The light from my flashlight illuminated a wall covered with photographs. They were pictures of people, men and women of different ages, some taken in the nearby forest. I recognized several villagers, including the old man in the store. But what really chilled my blood was seeing a picture of me, taken from a distance while I was working in my garden. The sound of footsteps upstairs broke the silence. My first impulse was to flee, but my feet were pinned to the ground. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I pointed it toward the staircase. I heard a creak, and then the thud of a door closing. I decided not to find out more. I ran out of the house, not caring about the noise it made, and didn't stop until I got home. That night I didn't sleep, and at dawn I packed my things and left the place. It was years before I thought of that man again. But one day, while browsing the news online, I came across an article. Several bodies had been found buried in the woods near the house. The suspect, the man who had been my neighbor, had disappeared without a trace. The article mentioned that in the house they found a room full of photographs, diaries, and tools. Among the victims, I recognized some faces I had seen in town, but what really terrified me was that, at the end of the article, they mentioned a list of names found in one of his notebooks. My name was there. Since then, every time I hear a noise outside my house, or see a shadow in the window, I wonder if he really managed to escape, and if perhaps he is still looking for me. My name is Gustavo, and this is the story of how the sea, which I once considered my refuge, became an abyss that marked me forever. Although the years have passed, every time I hear the pounding of the rain against the windows, it transported me back to those endless nights adrift. It all started as a work trip. I am a marine engineer, in charge of supervising the construction of oil rigs. I was assigned to a project off the coast of southern Chile, where I was to inspect a structure in progress. It was there that I met Captain Heriberto, who would command the vessel that would take me to the site. He was a man weathered by the sea, with a calmness that seemed unshakable. The crew was completed by Martin, his second in command, Manuel, the mechanic, and a navigational apprentice named Tomas, who was barely in his 20s. We set sail on a Tuesday at dawn, under an overcast sky that announced rain. The boat, La Estrella del Sur, was small but well equipped to withstand the rough waters of the region. The first moments of the trip went smoothly. We talked about our families and work, while Heriberto told stories of his years at sea. But that calm quickly crumbled. On the second day, the weather began to become unpredictable. The first drops of rain fell insistently, and the wind began to blow hard. Heriberto watched the radar with concern, although he tried to reassure us that it was only a passing storm. By nightfall, however, the waves had grown large enough to rock the boat as if it were a mere toy. It was then that we realized we were entering a true test of survival. The third day came with a massive storm. The sky was a black mass that seemed to crush us, and the waves reached heights I had never imagined. The icy water soaked everything, and each of us struggled to stay on our feet as Heriberto tried to maintain control of the boat. A brutal wind ripped off the communications antenna, leaving us stranded in the middle of the ocean. Despair was beginning to take hold of us. As night fell, a gigantic wave hit the hull with such force that it split it in two. The roar was deafening, followed by the sound of splintering wood and the screams of the crew. In an instant, all was chaos. I fell into the icy water, clinging desperately to a barrel floating nearby. The currents were relentless, and in the darkness I lost sight of the others. When the storm finally subsided, I found myself drifting in an endless ocean. On the horizon, I made out Manuel and Tomas clinging to a board. With great effort, I managed to swim to them. There was no sign of Heriberto or Martin. We were alone, facing a struggle for survival. The days that followed were a test of physical and mental endurance. The rain, though annoying, became our only source of drinking water. Manuel, with his innate skill, managed to catch small fish with his bare hands, which we ate raw. But hunger and exhaustion slowly consumed us. Tomas, the youngest, began to lose hope. I often found him crying silently while Manuel tried to cheer him up with stories of improbable rescues. On the night of the fourth day, Tomas became delirious. He talked about lights in the water and claimed that a ship was coming for us. Before we could stop him, He jumped into the sea, shouting that he was being rescued. We chased him with all our might, but the current quickly pulled him into the darkness. His screams died away in the distance, leaving us with an unbearable emptiness. With only Manuel and I on the wooden fragment, the isolation and despair became even more intense. Manuel, who had been a pillar of strength, began to show signs of breaking down. On the 6th day, I found him muttering to himself about the inevitability of death and the need for sacrifices. His eyes, once full of determination, now reflected a darkness that terrified me. That night, I awoke to Manuel creeping toward me with a sharp piece of wood he had improvised as a weapon. He whispered that one of us must disappear so that the other could survive. I barely had time to react. In the struggle, we both fell into the water. The struggle was brief, but intense, and in an instant of desperation I pushed him hard. His head hit against a piece of floating metal, and he lay motionless. I watched him drift away, his body being swallowed by the waves. The mixture of relief and guilt was overwhelming. The loneliness that followed was almost worse than the fear of death. Each night, the silence of the ocean was filled with imaginary shadows and the echoes of my companion's screams. Each dawn seemed like a punishment. My mind wandered between the hope of being rescued and the desire for it all to end at once. Finally, on the 9th day, a fishing boat found me. I could barely speak, and my muscles were so weakened that they had to carry me on board. The relief of being among humans again was indescribable, but I also carried with me a weight that was impossible to ignore. Back on land, I tried to rebuild my life, but the shipwreck left scars that will never fade. The faces of Tomas and Manuel visit me in my dreams, and the sound of the rain always reminds me of that endless struggle to survive. Although I returned home, a part of me was left forever in those dark and unforgiving waters. My name is Samuel, and if I ever thought that stories of online encounters were just tales to scare the naive, this experience proved me wrong. This is my story, one that started as a simple exchange of words on an anonymous platform and ended up becoming one of the scariest experiences of my life. It all started in a period of my life that I could not describe as happy. I had gotten out of a complicated relationship, and although it wasn't my first breakup, this one left a particular void. I decided to move to a smaller city to start over, looking for a change of scenery and a calmer pace of life. But what I didn't anticipate was the loneliness that came with that decision. Despite enjoying my new job as a freelance designer, my days were filled with a silence that sometimes became unbearable. Out of curiosity, I installed an anonymous chat application. I wasn't expecting anything serious, just conversations to pass the time. Most of the chats were insubstantial, quick exchanges that led nowhere. But one night I received a different message. Someone named Adrian wrote me something that, although I don't remember exactly, caught my attention because of how deep and thoughtful it sounded. There was something in his tone that stood out, a mixture of intelligence and warmth that invited me to continue the conversation. At first, our chats were light. We talked about books, movies, and, oddly enough, philosophy. Adrian seemed to know a lot about subjects that interested me, and our conversations flowed with a naturalness that I found addictive. I had never felt so understood by someone I didn't even know in person. Over time, the talks became more personal. I started sharing details about my life, something that looking back was probably a mistake. Adrian seemed especially interested in my daily routine, and although I didn't find it strange at first, his insistence on certain details began to unsettle me. He would ask me what time I usually went for a run, what my favorite coffee shop was, and even what the neighborhood I lived in was like. He would always find a subtle way to include these questions in our conversations, and I would naively answer without suspicion. One day, while walking through a nearby park, I received a message from him that chilled me to the bone. He commented that the place he was in looked beautiful at that hour. At first I thought it was a coincidence, but the more I thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. I hadn't told him I was in that park or that I liked to walk there. I felt a knot in my stomach as I looked around. I didn't see anyone suspicious, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me alone. Despite my discomfort, I decided to ignore it. I convinced myself that I must have mentioned it in some conversation and simply didn't remember it. However, things started to become more disturbing. Adrian started sending messages with increasingly precise details about my life. He knew what time I got home from work, what clothes I was wearing that day, and even mentioned a book I had left on my dining room table. I knew then that something was very wrong. I tried to confront him. I wrote to him saying that I didn't understand how he knew so many things about me and that I didn't want to talk to him anymore. His response was cold and calculated. He said he knew me better than I thought he did, that he had been following every step of my life since we started talking. His message was a mixture of threat and challenge, as if he enjoyed my bewilderment. That night, I decided to block him on the app. I also uninstalled the platform, hoping that would be enough to drive him away. But it wasn't. A few days later, I started receiving messages on my personal email, one that I had never shared with him. In those emails, Adrian would write to me as if nothing had happened, as if our connection was something unbreakable. He would tell me that I couldn't just ignore him, that our conversations meant something more. My anxiety grew exponentially. Every time I left the house, I felt like someone was following me. I began to notice small changes in my apartment. A window I had left closed appeared ajar. Objects I didn't remember moving were in different places. One night I found an envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a photograph taken from the street. It was my window, and in the picture you could clearly see my figure through the glass. The fear became unbearable. I decided to change the locks and install security cameras in my apartment. I also went to the police, taking the photographs and emails with me. Although the officers listened to me, they told me that without clear evidence that someone had broken into my home or followed me, they couldn't do much. I left the police station feeling more vulnerable than ever. The next few weeks were hell. The messages continued and they got darker and darker. Adrian started talking about things only I knew, secrets I had shared with him in confidence. It was as if he was using my own life against me, manipulating me so I couldn't escape his control. I felt trapped, not knowing who to trust. The climax came one night when I returned home from working late. Opening the door, I found a box on my living room floor. I didn't know how it had gotten there. Inside, there were several items that belonged to me, a keychain I had lost weeks before, a marker I used to use at my desk, and a handwritten note that read, "I'm always around." My whole body tensed. I knew I couldn't stay in that place any longer. The next day, I packed my essentials and left for a hotel without telling anyone. I left my apartment, my job, and my life as I knew it. I didn't want to run the risk of Adrian knowing where I was going. Little by little, I rebuilt my life in another city, changing my phone number and avoiding any kind of online interaction. Although years have passed since then, I still feel the after effects of what I experienced. I have a hard time trusting people, and every time someone shows too much interest in me, my mind goes back to those days of paranoia and fear. I don't know who Adrian really was, or how he managed to infiltrate my life so deeply. But I learned something important. Real terror doesn't always come from dark or unknown places. Sometimes it hides behind a screen, patiently waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My name is Julian, and although I am now 30 years old and have built a seemingly quiet life, there are still nights when I close my eyes, and I am that 12-year-old boy trapped in a house that was never a home. Growing up under the same roof as Esteban, my stepfather, was like living in a prison without bars. The walls were mute witnesses to a horror that no one outside our house could imagine. There were no ghosts, no monsters coming out of the closets. The real terror was human, palpable, and had a name. My mother, Cecilia, was a woman full of light. Before Esteban, I remember a mother who laughed, who cooked while singing, and who always found time to read me a bedtime story. But when he came into our lives, all that fell apart. At first, Esteban seemed like the ideal man, kind, caring, and willing to help us overcome the absence of my father, who had passed away when I was just 5 years old. He seemed to want to fill the void, but we soon realized that his affection came with strings attached, strict conditions. The violence didn't start right away. It was like a slowly seeping fog, imperceptible at first. Esteban had a gift for hurtful words, those that pierced the soul without the need to raise his voice. It all started with comments to my mother, that he was useless, that he never did anything right, that if it weren't for him, we would be out on the street. My mother would cringe a little more with each word, but I never responded to him. I think at the time she thought that putting up with him was the price of keeping us together and safe. I watched it all from a distance, too young to fully understand, but aware enough to sense that something was wrong. As the years went by, Esteban's words turned into screams, and then into blows. The first time I saw him hit my mother, something inside me snapped. It was an absurd argument over a lost receipt. Esteban pushed her against the wall and punched her in the stomach. My mother doubled over in pain, but she didn't scream. She didn't even cry. She just put her head down and waited for him to finish. That image was etched in my mind like a tattoo. That night, as my mother silently applied ice to her bruises, something changed in me. I realized that I couldn't stand idly by, but I also couldn't confront Esteban directly. I knew that a man like him had no limits, and my mother was suffering enough. So I began to plan. It wasn't an elaborate plan. It was more a series of vague ideas that intermingled in my childish mind. I looked for ways to protect us, from calling a family member to researching domestic violence shelters at the library. But every step I took was filled with fear. What if Esteban found out what I was doing? What if his anger turned on me? Fear became my constant companion. Every time I heard the sound of keys in the lock, my heart would race. When he arrived early and in a good mood, there was a brief respite. But if he arrived late and smelling of alcohol, we knew the night would be long. On those occasions, my mother and I would walk as if on glass, watching every word, every move, trying not to provoke his anger. But with Esteban, there were never any guarantees. Sometimes, even silence enraged him. One day, everything got out of control. It was an ordinary afternoon, and I had left a window open in the living room. The rain had soaked part of the couch, and Esteban noticed when he arrived. His anger was immediate. Before I could apologize or explain, I felt his hand cross my face. It was the first time he had hit me, and although the physical pain was intense, what really shocked me was the realization that I was now a target for him as well. Until that moment, I had always believed that as long as I stayed out of his way, I would be safe. But that idea crumbled in an instant. After that day, his violence became more unpredictable. Not only was he hitting my mother, now he was also hitting me for the most insignificant reasons. A misplaced cup, an incomplete task, a simple sigh at the wrong time. Each blow strengthened my determination to escape, but it also increased my fear. I knew we couldn't do it alone. We needed help, but my mother always refused. She said things would get better, that Esteban would change. I knew he wouldn't. That's when I discovered that my mother had a small savings fund stashed away. It was a modest amount, barely enough for a few days, but to me, it represented our only hope. I began to devise a more concrete plan. The key was to find the right moment, a time when Esteban would be distracted enough not to notice our absence until we were already far away. That opportunity came one early morning, after Esteban got drunk and fell sound asleep on the couch. My mother and I packed the essentials, clothes, savings, and some important documents. We left the house with our hearts in our throats, fearing he would wake up at any moment. We walked for hours in the rain, aimlessly, until we reached the house of a neighbor who had always been kind to us. We told her what had happened, and she, without hesitation, helped us contact an organization that assists victims of domestic violence. The next few days were a whirlwind. We were moved to a shelter in a different city, where we could finally feel safe. But, although we had escaped physically, the emotional scars remained. My mother began to rebuild her life, but the sparkle in her eyes never fully returned. I, for my part, lived with a mixture of relief and guilt. relief for having escaped, but guilt for not having been able to protect her sooner. Today, looking back, I realized that what I lived through was not just a dark period of my childhood. It was a brutal lesson in fear, resilience, and the power of survival. Although time has passed, the shadows of those years still haunt me. Every time I hear a voice rising or a thud in the distance, my body instinctively tenses. But I also know that fear does not define me. What defines me is having found the courage to escape, even when it seemed impossible. Esteban's story and what we lived through will never completely disappear from my memory, but with each passing day, I strive to build something better. Because, although the past hurts, it also reminds me that even in the darkest moments, there is always a way out. There is always hope. I never knew exactly at what point things started to get weird, or when I stopped feeling safe at work. I was an ordinary man, with an ordinary job and an ordinary life. The kind of guy who, while not the center of attention, always seemed to be in the right place at the right time. However, everything changed when he arrived. I didn't know it then, but from his first appearance, something broke in my routine. At first, Alex seemed like just another person in the office, a nice guy who talked about soccer, movies, and the weather. He was nothing extraordinary, but he was always smiling and making comments to make others laugh. We became friends easily, or so I thought at the time. He was one of those fellows who start out as acquaintances, then become people you sit down to lunch with, and little by little, the bond grows closer. But it was all so subtle that I didn't even realize when the line between what was a friendship and what was a toxic relationship blurred. I remember it was on a Tuesday, around 11:30 a.m., when it all started. I was working on a presentation for an important client, focused on the charts and data I needed to review, when Alex approached my desk. He made a joke about my style of dress, something common between us, but this time something in his tone puzzled me. It wasn't a friendly joke like the others. There was something dark behind his laughter, but that first time, I let it go, thinking that maybe he was just in a bad mood, or that I had misunderstood him. The next day, he repeated the same formula, only this time, the joke about my clothes was followed by a comment about how weird I looked at meetings. It all seemed harmless, part of a camaraderie we used to share in the office. However, I soon realized that these jokes were not just harmless. There was a pattern behind them, something that became more uncomfortable with each interaction. Weeks passed, and the harassment became more explicit. Alex started making comments about my personal habits, things I had never told him. He laughed about what I ate for lunches, and started questioning me about why I never went to bars after work like everyone else. At first, I tried to ignore him, but his insinuations became more specific, almost as if he was watching my every move. I remember one afternoon, while I was in the break room, he looked at me from the corner with that smile that was already starting to become unbearable. He said nothing, but his gaze followed me, and although his face reflected calm, something in his attitude made me uneasy. At one point, teasing wasn't enough. Alex started looking for ways to invade my personal space. He would leave notes on my desk, insinuating that he was keeping an eye on my work. The worst was once, when I walked into the office and found a photograph of me that I never knew how he had taken. I was at a conference, in the distance, with my phone in my hand. I didn't understand how she had gotten it, but the fact that she had it gave me a dull fear. I asked him if he knew anything about it, but he smiled evasively at me and said he didn't remember where it came from. That smile, so empty, gave me chills. At that point, I already knew something wasn't right, but what worried me most was that I couldn't prove that anything was really dangerous. No one else was seeing what I was seeing. Apparently, everyone thought it was just one of those jokes that had always been part of the office dynamic. The strangest thing was that sometimes I would find myself in conversations with other colleagues who would say that Alex had always been like that, but it never bothered them. The sense of paranoia grew, and with it, my bewilderment. As for me, I began to feel like I had no control over anything. Jokes that were once harmless began to feel like veiled threats. If I was late for work, Alex had something to say about it, always with a reproachful tone disguised as a joke. If I ever forgot to answer an email, he would mention it out loud as a way of embarrassing me. And although no one else noticed, I felt that his gaze was always on me, evaluating every step I took. One day, on a random Monday, I arrived at the office after a weekend full of work at home. I was exhausted, and my mind was foggy from lack of rest. When I walked in, Alex was in the kitchen, as usual, making some kind of loud comment about the office coffee. But what made me uncomfortable that time was the way he looked at me, like he was waiting for something, like he was testing my limits, looking for an answer that would give him power over me. As time went on, I realized that my interactions with him were becoming increasingly tense. He was not only invading my personal space, but also manipulating situations to his advantage. On one occasion, he asked me to stay later to finish a joint project. I agreed, not because I wanted to, but because I felt that if I said no, the situation might get worse. That afternoon, he left me working alone in the office, saying he had to leave to make an urgent call. When I finished my work and tried to leave, I found the lights off and the exit door closed. There was no one else in the building, and my phone had no signal. The feeling of being trapped was unbearable. It was several minutes before Alex suddenly appeared, as if nothing had happened. His relaxed attitude made me feel even more vulnerable. At first, I didn't know how to react. I was caught in a web of subtle manipulations, and even though I tried to pull away, he always found a way to get into my life. Once, after a particularly tense meeting, he told me that I should prepare for the worst if I didn't change my attitude. I thought he was just playing on my nerves, but the look he gave me told me he wasn't kidding. The comments, the jokes, all seemed like a way to destabilize me, to make me doubt my own judgment. But the worst came a week later, when I found a message in my locker. It was a direct, clear, handwritten threat. I didn't fully understand it at the time, but the stakes were no longer just a matter of discomfort. The threat said that if I didn't change my behavior, the consequences would be dire. I felt violated, unable to defend myself. The authorities could do nothing, as there was no evidence. No one would believe me. I was completely alone in this. Every day it became more unbearable. The anxiety of not knowing what I would do next ate me up inside. Finally, I decided to talk to Human Resources. What I never imagined was that they already knew something about Alex. What I didn't know was that he had actually been working there long before I arrived, and his behavior had already been a topic of conversation on several occasions. No one had taken the complaints seriously. But now, the atmosphere was so charged with tension that it could no longer be ignored. I didn't want to confront him directly, but I was forced to. The confrontation was quick, almost wordless, but the feeling of having been manipulated, of having been caught in a web I did not fully understand, did not leave me. Alex was still there, with his calculating smile and his heavy jokes. Although things changed slightly after my complaint, his presence remained a shadow creeping through the halls, always nearby, watching, waiting. I will never know if he really wanted to hurt me, or if he just enjoyed watching me suffer. But what I do know is that the shadows he left in my life never completely disappeared. And although there was no direct confrontation or physical violence, it was the psychological violence that really destroyed me. My name is Yoel, and what I'm about to tell you is something that marked me deeply. There are nights when I close my eyes and everything comes back. The sounds, the smells, and above all, the feeling that something dark and dangerous lurks in the shadows. That experience not only changed my life, it taught me how fragile the line between the everyday and horror can be. That night, I was driving home from a long day in a nearby city. I had spent the afternoon working in an endless meeting that left me exhausted and eager to get home fast. The road I took went through a rural area, with fields on both sides and hardly any lighting. As I drove on, the lights of my car seemed to be the only ones in that vastness of asphalt and darkness. The rain started as a whisper, a few scattered drops hitting the windshield. Within minutes, it became a torrential downpour. Visibility diminished, and the sound of the water covered almost every other noise. I slowed down, keeping my focus on the road, but with each kilometer I drove through what felt like more eerie loneliness. That's when I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the road, in the rain, waving his arms in distress. At first, my instinct was to ignore him. It wasn't safe to stop in such a lonely place. But something in the way he moved, desperate, made me feel I couldn't leave him there. I went against my better judgment and slowed down. It was a man, perhaps in his 40s, soaked to the bone and wearing an expression of utter exhaustion. He explained to me that his car had been stranded further back, on a side road, and that he needed help. There was something strange in his look, a mixture of urgency and coldness that made me nervous, but the rain was relentless, and his situation seemed genuine. I offered him a ride to the nearest gas station. The ride was uncomfortable. He barely spoke, and when he did, his words seemed directionless, as if he was more focused on watching me than on the journey. I tried to break the silence with casual questions, but his answers were vague. At some point, I noticed that he carried a small knife on his belt. He told me he used it for camping, but the explanation did not alleviate my growing sense of danger. After a few minutes, the man asked me to turn onto a side road. He insisted it was a quicker route to the gas station. Something inside me screamed that I shouldn't do it, but I didn't want to provoke a confrontation. I took the detour, and soon we were on a narrow path, surrounded by tall trees that barely let the light from my headlights through. Then everything changed. The man asked me to stop the car. His tone, once calm but strange, became cold and authoritative. He ordered me to turn off the engine and lights. My heart began to pound as I tried to remain calm. I had no idea what was going to happen, but I knew I was in a dangerous situation. Before I could react, he opened the door and got out of the car, disappearing into the darkness. I stood motionless, listening to the sound of the rain hitting the roof. Suddenly, a thud shook the vehicle, as if something had hit it. Then another, louder. I turned on the lights and turned my head, but saw nothing. The next moment was crucial. I decided I couldn't just stand there waiting for whatever he had in mind. I started the engine and accelerated, regardless of whether he came back to the car or not. The road was slippery and narrow, but I didn't care. My only priority was to get away as fast as possible. I hadn't gone far when in the rearview mirror, I saw something that paralyzed me. A flashing light emerged through the trees, as if someone was following me with a flashlight. I accelerated further, ignoring the sharp curves and the branches that scraped the bodywork. Finally, I came to a junction I recognized and took the main road. After a few eternal minutes, I saw the lights of a gas station in the distance. I entered the place and headed straight for the employees, asking them to call the police. My body was shaking and my words were slurred. When the officers arrived, I told them what had happened. They promised to search the area, but the man seemed to have disappeared. That night, I could hardly sleep. It was days before the police contacted me with an update. They had found an abandoned car near where I picked up the man. Inside, they found disturbing items, ropes, duct tape, and a notebook full of rambling notes. They never managed to find him, but the evidence suggested it wasn't the first time he had tried something similar. Since then, I never stopped the car on lonely roads, no matter how desperate the situation seems. That night taught me that the real terror is not always in the supernatural, but in the intentions of those who cross your path. The sound of the rain, once soothing to me, is now a constant reminder of how close I came to not making it out of that experience alive. My name is Daniel, and what I am about to tell you happened 10 years ago, although I still feel that I cannot escape that experience. It all started with something that, at the time, seemed like a simple adventure, an invitation to an exclusive game. It was neither a traditional escape room nor a common recreational activity. According to the email I received, it was a private event, designed to challenge the physical and mental limits of its participants. It promised adrenaline, mystery, and a cash prize. At the time, young and naive, I thought it would be exciting to try something different. The venue was an old mansion on the outskirts of the city, abandoned, but with an atmosphere of decadent grandeur. Upon arrival, I met a small group of people, all strangers to me. There were 6 of us in all, and each seemed to have their own reasons for being there. Curiosity, financial need, or, as in my case, the simple desire to experience something out of the ordinary. We were greeted by 2 formally dressed hosts, wearing masks that hid their faces. They explained the basic rules of the game: solve puzzles, overcome challenges, and advance through the different areas of the mansion. There was one specific condition. Once we entered, we could not leave the game until we completed it. If anyone tried to leave before then, they would be automatically eliminated. They didn't explain what eliminated meant, but we assumed we would simply be out of the prize. At first, it all seemed like a harmless game. The first few tests were puzzles that we solved together, exploring the mansion as a team. There was an air of camaraderie among the participants, although the tension increased with each challenge. However, the dynamic changed in the third room. The game shifted from collaboration to outright competition. We were forced to face each other in a test of strength and endurance. The person who came last would lose points in the ranking system, although no one knew what exactly that meant. That's when everything started to go dark. The last place participant, a man named Adrian, was led out of the room by the hosts. We were told that he had been eliminated and that we would never see him again. I thought he would have simply been let out of the mansion, but we never heard the sound of the front door opening or the sound of a car driving away. Just a silence that left us with more questions than answers. As we progressed, the challenges became more physical and psychological. There were rooms full of traps, tests that required taking extreme risks, and puzzles whose solution involved sacrificing time, personal items, and even physical safety. What disturbed me the most was when we were forced to vote on who should receive a penalty. It was a punishment that no one wanted, but which was not clearly explained to us. When we reluctantly decided to penalize a participant named Marina, the host separated her from the group. She returned minutes later, limping and with an expression I will never forget. Her lips were trembling, but she didn't want to talk about what had happened. It was then that I realized that this was not just a game. Every decision we made had real, tangible consequences, and the price of losing was too high. I tried to convince the group that we needed to unite and demand answers, but fear and distrust had already set in. We were all too busy trying to survive to think about anything else. In one of the last tests, I discovered something I will never forget. While searching for clues in one of the rooms, I accidentally opened a door leading to a basement. There, in the shadows, I saw what appeared to be camera recordings. The screens showed every corner of the mansion, including the evidence we had already passed. But the most terrifying thing was to see images of the eliminated participants. They were not outside, not free. They were locked in small makeshift cells, some unconscious, others screaming in despair. I was overcome with terror. Now I understood that there was no way to get out of that place unscathed. There were only 2 options: win the game or become one of the victims. With my heart pounding, I quickly closed the door and pretended not to have seen anything. I could not afford to reveal my discovery. If I did, I was sure the hosts would find a way to silence me. When there were only 3 of us left, the game reached its climax. We were ushered into a completely white room, with a table in the center. On it, there were 3 sealed envelopes. Each of us had to take an envelope and decide whether to go ahead or withdraw. But we already knew that withdrawing was not a real option. When I opened my envelope, I found a simple sentence written, "Last to decide loses." At that moment, I understood that the game was not just about strength or intelligence, but about psychological manipulation. Time stood still as the 3 of us looked at each other, trying to read each other's intentions. Finally, one of the participants made the decision to stay seated, letting the rest of us move forward. He was instantly eliminated, carried out of the room by the hosts, who dragged him away as if he were a worthless object. In the end, there were only 2 of us left. The last test was simple in appearance, but loaded with an unbearable moral weight. We had to decide which of us deserved to win. There were no more riddles or challenges, just a final showdown based on our own words. The person who best convinced the hosts would win the prize. I never knew what criteria they used to decide the winner, but it wasn't me. The other contestant, a woman named Gabriella, was declared the winner and escorted out of the mansion. I, on the other hand, was taken to the basement where I had seen the cells. I managed to escape months later, but that's another chapter I'd rather not tell yet. What I learned in that game is that true terror comes not from the supernatural, but from what people are capable of doing when they lose their humanity. The mansion was demolished, and those responsible disappeared without a trace. But every time I close my eyes, I relive those ordeals, those moments of despair, and I wonder if I will ever recover the peace I lost there. My name is Guillermo, and what I am about to share is not something I talk about often. However, if this story can serve as a warning to anyone, then the memories are worth facing. This is not about love as the fairy tales paint it, but about how a toxic relationship can masquerade as affection, and little by little, strip you of everything you are. 6 years ago, my life was pretty simple. I was working as an architect, a profession I was passionate about, but I had been feeling lonely for some time. I had come from a long relationship that ended bitterly, and I had taken refuge in work to avoid thinking about what had gone wrong. It was in this context that I met Elisa, a woman who at first seemed almost perfect. Her energy filled any space, her smile brightened any day, and within minutes of conversation, I was fascinated. We met at a conference on sustainable design. She approached me first, asking questions about my work, and before I knew it, we were in deep and lively conversation. She told me about her projects, her worldview, and everything about her seemed to click with me. It was easy to fall in love with her charisma and enthusiasm, and when she asked for my number to stay in touch, I felt that something good was finally happening in my life. After that first meeting, we started seeing each other frequently. At first, everything was wonderful. Elisa was attentive, caring, and always seemed to care about me. She introduced me to her friends as if I were someone special, organized plans for the two of us, and made me feel that, after so long, someone finally saw the best in me. But little by little, that same dedication began to transform into something darker. Elisa began to influence my life in subtle ways. At first, it was small comments, suggestions on how to dress better or what restaurants to avoid. Then, she began to question the people I spent time with. She would tell me that some friends didn't seem to really care about my well-being, that my sister was too nosy, or that my boss didn't value me enough. At first, I saw it as genuine concern. Who doesn't want a partner who cares about them? But over time, those suggestions turned into demands. One night, after hanging out with my friends, Elisa asked me why I needed to spend so much time with them. She said that I was growing up and they weren't, that our relationship should be my priority. I didn't see it as a negative thing at the time. I thought it was a sign of how much she cared about me. So I started to give in. I canceled outings, avoided mentioning conversations with girlfriends at work, and even turned down a promotion because it meant more time away from home. I thought I was sacrificing myself for the relationship, but in reality, I was losing myself. Over time, her criticism became more constant. If I didn't do what she expected, she would accuse me of being selfish or not valuing her. On one occasion, she went through my phone without my permission and confronted me about a completely innocent message I'd exchanged with a coworker. She told me that she couldn't trust me if I wasn't completely transparent. That word transparency became his excuse to invade every aspect of my life. Soon the arguments began to escalate. Elisa had an almost supernatural ability to turn any situation on its head. If I ever tried to point out something that made me uncomfortable, I would end up apologizing to her for making her feel bad. Every disagreement became a test of my love for her, and I, terrified at the thought of losing her, always found a way to give in. Elisa also began to control my emotions. If I was happy about something that didn't involve her, she would be distant, as if my joy was a betrayal of her. If I was sad or frustrated, she made sure I knew that my problems were nothing compared to hers. Everything revolved around her, and I became accustomed to walking on an emotional minefield, always worried about not upsetting her. My friends and family began to notice the change. My sister, Laura, confronted me one day and told me she didn't recognize me. She told me about how Elisa isolated and controlled me, but when I tried to talk to Elisa about it, everything turned against Laura. She told me that my sister was jealous, that she didn't want to see me happy. I knew, deep down, that something wasn't right, but I convinced myself that Elisa was right. I told myself that love required sacrifices. The breaking point came one night, after a particularly intense argument. Elisa had organized a dinner with some friends of hers, and I was late because my boss asked me to finish an urgent project. When I got home, she was furious. Her anger wasn't just about the dinner, but about everything she said I wasn't doing right. That night, she threw my phone against the wall and broke a lamp in a fit of rage. I had never seen that side of her before, and it was like a veil fell from my eyes. Despite that, I still didn't leave. Elisa apologized to me the next day, crying and promising to change. She told me that I was her world, and that she couldn't imagine her life without me. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think things could get better. But every time I tried to imagine a future together, I felt an unbearable weight in my chest. The final blow came a few months later, when I discovered something that changed everything. One day, while cleaning the house, I found a notebook that Elisa had left on her desk. In it, she had written thoughts and reflections about our relationship. What I read chilled me to the bone. She talked about how she manipulated my insecurities to keep me close, how she didn't trust me but didn't want to lose me either. It was as if everything I had felt but never been able to articulate was there, written in his own words. That same night, I made the decision to leave. I packed up the essentials while she was gone, leaving behind everything I couldn't carry. It was not easy. Elisa tried to contact me, first with messages and then by showing up at my work. But something in me had changed. For the first time in years, I saw clearly that I deserved better. The months that followed were a slow process of rebuilding. I reconnected with my family and friends, although some bonds were irreparable after so long. I sought help to understand how I had gotten so far into such a damaging relationship, and how I could prevent something like that from happening again. Today, when I think of Elisa, I don't feel hate, but I don't feel nostalgia either. I just feel a kind of relief, like someone waking up from a long and dense nightmare. I learned that love shouldn't hurt, that it shouldn't consume your identity or isolate you from the world. If you are in a relationship that makes you feel less, that fills you with doubts and isolates you, I want you to know that there is a way out. It won't be easy, but regaining your freedom and peace is worth every step. My name is Santiago, and what I'm about to relate not only marked a before and after in my life, but also redefined what I understand by responsibility and humanity. 5 years ago, I lived through an experience that haunts me to this day. It was a seemingly ordinary day, but it ended up turning into a nightmare that I will never forget. It all started with a simple plan, a getaway to the mountains to get away from everyday stress and enjoy a day outdoors. I chose a hiking trail I had visited a couple of times before, a meandering path that led to a hidden lake in the middle of the mountains. That place had always been my refuge, a space where I could think clearly. That day, the weather was perfect. The sun was shining, and the fresh air made every breath feel refreshing. Arriving at the starting point, I was surprised that there was almost no one there. The parking lot was empty except for a couple of old cars. I figured I would have the place to myself, which, at the time, seemed ideal. The hike started smoothly. The tall trees formed a natural canopy that filtered the sunlight, and the sounds of the forest created a soothing soundtrack. I walked at a brisk pace for an hour until I reached a fork. One trail led to the lake, while the other led to a canyon I had never explored. I was curious and decided to take the road less traveled, hoping to discover something new. As I progressed, I noticed that the terrain became more rugged and steep. There were no clear signs or markers to indicate direction, but the challenge excited me. I continued climbing until I reached a point where the trail gave way to a narrow passage next to a ravine. The air felt colder there, and the sense of isolation was palpable. It was then that I heard a sound that made me stop in my tracks. It was a scream, high-pitched and piercing, coming from somewhere up ahead. My first instinct was to think that someone was in danger. My heart began to beat faster, and without a second thought, I quickened my pace toward the source of the sound. As I advanced, the screams became clearer, mixed with what sounded like sobs. Finally, I came to a clearing where I saw a man clinging desperately to a rock ledge, on the verge of falling into the void. I approached carefully, trying not to scare him any more than he already seemed to be. The man, who I later learned was named Tomas, was covered in dust and blood. He seemed to have slipped as he walked along the edge of the ravine. In his eyes, I could see a deep fear. I tried to remain calm and quickly assess the situation. The ledge he was clinging to did not seem strong enough to hold him for long. I decided to act immediately. I lay face down on the ground and extended my arm towards him. I asked him to try to propel himself up while I pulled on it. His hand was cold and clammy, and I noticed that he barely had any strength. I was trying to keep my balance as I pulled him along, but the weight combined with the unstable terrain made the task nearly impossible. Time seemed to slow down. Every second that passed increased the pressure. I felt my body begin to give way, and I feared we might both fall. I managed to get Tomas to reach the edge and hold on with both hands. It looked like I was succeeding, but just when I thought I was safe, the ground beneath my feet gave way. I lost my balance and fell forward, slamming into the rocks. Although I managed to grab hold of a nearby root, my body was dangling at a dangerous angle. We were now two people fighting for our lives on the edge of a cliff. Tomas was trying to climb up, but his movements were clumsy and desperate. The root I was clinging to began to creak, and I knew it wouldn't hold much longer. In a moment of pure instinct, I let go and rolled to the side, landing hard on a more stable surface. From there, I tried to help Tomas again, but it was too late. His fingers slipped off the rock and I saw him fall. His body disappeared in a matter of seconds, and then, the dull sound of his impact filled the air. I froze, unable to process what had just happened. My mind replayed the scene over and over, as if searching for a detail that might have changed the outcome. Finally, I stood up and, staggering, looked for a way to descend to the bottom of the ravine. I needed to confirm what my mind refused to accept. The descent was slow and grueling. Every step was fraught with danger, but the weight of guilt pushed me forward. When I finally reached the bottom, I found Tomas motionless among the rocks. His body was twisted in a way that left no room for doubt. The silence surrounding him was deafening. I took out my phone to call emergency, but the signal was non-existent. My only option was to return to the starting point to seek help. Before I left, I knelt down beside him and closed my eyes, mumbling an apology I knew he could never hear. The walk back was one of the most heartbreaking experiences of my life. Every step I took felt like I was abandoning him. When I finally reached the parking lot, I saw a couple who had just arrived. I explained to them what had happened, and they called rescue services while offering me water and some comfort. The wait was interminable. When the rescuers arrived, I guided them to the place where Tomas had fallen. They recovered his body with care and professionalism, but the emptiness I felt inside me did not disappear. One of the rescuers assured me that he had done everything he could, but his words did not ease my burden. Later, I learned that Tomas was a math teacher who loved nature. He had gone to the mountain that day to clear his mind after a difficult week. He was a kind and generous man, his friends and family said. Thinking of the life he left behind, of the people who loved him and were now suffering for their loss, tore me apart. Since that day, I have tried to find comfort in the fact that I did the best I could. But the truth is that the memory of his fall haunts me. Every time I see a ravine or hear the wind through the trees, I relive those moments. The mountain, once my refuge, is now a place full of ghosts. I've been back a couple of times, not to walk, but to leave flowers at the place where Tomas spent his last moments. It's my way of honoring his memory and reminding myself that life is fragile, and that sometimes even our best intentions are not enough. My name is Raphael, and although I have never been a superstitious person, there is something about rainy days that now gives me a knot in my stomach. They used to be comforting, a good excuse to stay at home with a hot coffee and enjoy the calm that rain brings. But all that changed the day my wife's, Mariana's, life and mine took a dark and frightening turn that I never imagined I would face. It was a gray Tuesday, the kind where the clouds seem to devour the sky and the sound of rain accompanies every thought. Mariana and I had decided to go to the doctor that morning, a routine checkup we had been putting off. She had been tired lately, something we both attributed to her job as a teacher. Mariana had always been a strong woman, full of energy and optimism. Her smile was my refuge, and her laughter, the most beautiful sound I knew. But in the last few months, that energy had faded. There were days when she could barely get out of bed. Her once radiant skin had taken on a pale hue, and her eyes, always full of life, looked dull. I insisted that we go to the doctor. She, as always, tried to play it down, but finally agreed. I never thought that decision would lead to one of the most difficult tests of our lives. We arrived at the hospital early, in a steady rain that didn't seem to want to stop. As we waited in the ward, the sound of water hitting the windows was the only noise that broke the awkward silence between us. Mariana held my hand, but I could feel her nervousness. I tried to reassure her with words, telling myself that it was probably something minor, maybe stress or anemia, nothing that couldn't be fixed with a change in diet or a vacation. The doctor examined her and ordered a series of tests. He told us to come back in a few hours to pick up the results. We decided to wait in a nearby coffee shop. I remember ordering 2 coffees, but I didn't try mine. Mariana tried to smile, as if everything was normal, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. We chatted about trivial things, avoiding talking about what we both feared. When we finally returned to the office, the atmosphere had changed. The doctor, who had previously greeted us with a professional smile, now looked serious, almost somber. He asked us to take a seat, and when he began to speak, each word was like a direct blow to the chest. Mariana had a tumor. It was aggressive and advanced. The words echoed in my head like an endless echo. Cancer, metastasis, immediate treatment. I looked at Mariana, expecting to see her collapse, but she remained silent, taking in the news with an eerie calm. I, on the other hand, felt the ground open up under my feet. How was that possible? She was young, healthy. We had plans, dreams. All of that seemed to crumble in an instant. The doctor explained the options: chemotherapy, radiation therapy, surgery. It all sounded cold, technical, like he was talking about someone else. We left the hospital in a rain that was heavier than before. We said nothing on the way home. The sound of the drops hitting the roof of the car was the only thing that broke the silence. That night, Mariana and I sat in the living room, hugging. Finally, she cried, and I cried with her. At that moment, I understood that we were not only facing an illness, but also a fight against time, fear, and uncertainty. We knew the road would be long and painful, but we had no choice. The following days were a whirlwind of consultations, analysis, and difficult decisions. Mariana began treatment soon after, and with it came a new reality for us. The chemotherapy weakened her to the point where she could barely stand up. Her hair, which she loved so much, began to fall out, but that was not what affected her the most. What really devastated her was the loss of her independence. Mariana, who had always been self-sufficient, now depended on me for everything from cooking to helping her get dressed. I tried to stay strong for her, but there were nights when I would lock myself in the bathroom and cry silently. I felt helpless, terrified of the possibility of losing her. However, in the midst of all that chaos, I also discovered a strength in us that I didn't know existed. Mariana, even in her weakest moments, found a way to smile. She would tell me that she could not give up, not for herself, but for us. Months passed, and every day was a battle. There were moments of hope, like when the doctors told us that the treatment was working, that the tumor was shrinking. But there were also relapses, infections, and endless nights in the hospital. I learned to live with the constant fear of a call in the middle of the night, of a test bringing bad news. One day in particular, while we were in the hospital, Mariana looked at me and told me she wanted to go out to feel the rain. I protested, worried about her health, but she insisted. I helped her up, and with difficulty, carried her to a small garden in the center of the building. There, in the soft rain, I saw her close her eyes and raise her face to the sky. At that moment, she seemed at peace, as if the rain purified her of all pain and sadness. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, we could still find beauty. Mariana taught me that. She taught me that life is not measured by the days we have, but by what we do with them. Today, as I speak about this, Mariana continues to struggle. There have been victories and defeats, good days and bad. But we keep going, together. I don't find the rain as comforting as I used to, but it doesn't terrify me either. Now I see it as a symbol of resilience, of the human capacity to endure the unimaginable and keep moving forward. Our story is not unique, but it is ours. It is a testament to love, to strength, and to the hope to be found even on the grayest of days. And while I don't know what the future holds, I know that we will face whatever comes, together, under whatever storms life throws at us. My name is Felix, and although I never wanted to talk about this, the shadow of what happened 2 years ago haunts me constantly. This is the story of the loss of my son, Mauricio, and the anguish that has consumed me every day since that terrible event. It all started one rainy afternoon in October, one of those that feels like the sky is going to collapse at any moment. Like every day, I was working in my office when I received a message from Mauricio, a message as normal as any other. Mauricio was a bright boy, full of life, with a heart that didn't fit in his chest. Since he was a little boy, he had shown an unusual maturity for his age. He loved photography, spent hours capturing moments with his camera, and often showed me his photos, always seeking my approval. Despite our differences, we always understood each other, and our relationship was, to say the least, the best ever. About that time, he wrote to tell me that he was at the mall, that he had bought something he needed for a school project. That day seemed to be like any other. I remember that message made me smile. I was glad he was taking the initiative in his studies. But after that, I never heard from him again. I tried calling him several times, but the phone rang and no one answered. At first I thought he must have run out of battery, or maybe he was at the movies, as he sometimes did, disconnected for a couple of hours. However, as the minutes passed, something inside me told me that something was not right. At that moment, fear began to settle in my chest, like an invisible but overwhelming presence. I decided to leave work and went straight to the mall where he told me he would be. During the drive, my mind played with thousands of possible scenarios, all more terrifying than the previous one. My cell phone still wasn't ringing, and time seemed to drag on longer than possible. When I arrived, the mall was full of people, as always at that time of day. I looked for him everywhere, hoping to see him coming out of a store or walking through the crowd. But he was not there. His absence was total, and the feeling of uneasiness grew as I walked through the aisles of the place. After almost an hour of fruitless searching, I decided it would be best to contact security. Perhaps he had left his phone somewhere, or had met with an accident without my knowledge. I explained the situation to one of the guards, who accompanied me to the security office to check the cameras. It was there that everything became a whirlwind. The images showed Mauricio walking calmly through the mall, as he had told me in his message. However, something was not right. The last images showed him being approached by a man in the parking lot of the place, a man I didn't recognize, who seemed to be waiting for his arrival. That moment was the first indication that something horrible was happening. The guard offered to help me look for more, but the feeling of helplessness enveloped me. As we were walking, a call came into my phone. It was an unfamiliar voice, with a low tone that chilled my blood. The man told me that if I wanted to see my son again, I should follow his instructions, no questions asked. Of course, my heart stopped. The only thing I could think at that moment was that someone had kidnapped him. Anguish washed over me like a giant wave. From that instant on, the instructions I received were clear and concise. Go to a park far from the city. Wait there, without calling the police, without alerting anyone. It was a race against time, and there was no margin for error. As I drove to the park, my mind kept wondering who could be behind all this. I couldn't understand why anyone would want to hurt Mauricio. He was not a boy who had ever had any enemies, at least not that I knew of. By the time I reached the park, night had settled in the air. I was all alone, surrounded only by trees and darkness. My breathing was deep, forced, as my eyes scanned the place for any sign of life. I had decided to follow the instructions to the letter, but my mind kept thinking about how I had gotten to this point. And as I waited, I felt a shiver run down my back. Something was not right. The call, the instructions, it all seemed like something out of a nightmare. Suddenly, a car appeared on the horizon, slowly approaching. It was not the kind of car one expects to see at that hour, and it made me feel even more vulnerable. The car stopped a few meters from where I was standing, and out of it came the man who had been following Mauricio. He was tall, with a dark jacket, and a mask that did not let me see his face. Before I could react, he signaled me to come closer. I approached, and that's when I saw what I had never wanted to see before. In the back seat of the car, Mauricio was lying there, unconscious, looking weak, as if he couldn't defend himself. My son's eyes were closed, and his face was covered with marks that I didn't know how to interpret. The man told me that if I wanted to see him alive, I had to pay a sum of money that was impossible to gather at that moment. My mind became clouded. Helplessness and terror were killing me inside, but there was nothing I could do. The only thing that mattered to me at that moment was to save my son, even if I did not have the resources to do so. I tried to negotiate, but the man was not willing to give in. At that moment, Mauricio woke up briefly, and our eyes met. I could not bear it. Seeing him so vulnerable, so small, completely tore me apart. But desperation drove me to do the unthinkable. While the kidnapper was distracted for a moment, I tried to approach the car door, intending to grab Mauricio and run away. It was a fatal mistake. The man saw me move and, in the blink of an eye, pounced on me. The last image I have of that night is of his grim face as he struck me, the rage in his eyes. In the midst of the confusion, the sound of a gunshot broke the silence, and everything faded away. I woke up in the hospital, my body bruised, but with only one question on my mind. Where was my son? The police informed me that the kidnapper had escaped, but Mauricio had not survived. The news of his death hit me like a dagger in the heart. I could do nothing. I could not save him. I could not be the father he needed. The void left by his absence will never be filled. And every day, I wake up wondering if I could have done something different. Today, 2 years later, I'm still searching for answers, but I know I will never find them. The guilt consumes me. The nights are long, and every time I close my eyes, I see him there, in the back seat of the car, his eyes full of fear, waiting for his father to arrive to save him. But I couldn't. My name is Uriel, and throughout my life, I always knew that I would face challenges that would test my strength. But I never imagined that the storm that would mark my existence would be something so close, something I could not stop. The destruction of my brother Kleiber due to his addiction. Kleiber and I grew up in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by mountains and lush nature that, although it didn't solve all our needs, gave us moments of peace. Life was not easy, but we always had the unconditional support of our parents, who taught us the value of effort and perseverance. I was the oldest, and Kleiber, always lively and full of dreams, followed me like a shadow. Sometimes we competed, sometimes we helped each other. There was a perfect balance, or at least I thought so. It all started with Michelangelo, a friend of Kleiber. Michelangelo was a guy who had something enigmatic about him, something that made everyone feel attracted to him. Somehow his presence was always surrounded by a somber atmosphere, and he seemed to have the power to shape the lives of those around him. At first I didn't think much of it, although Kleiber began to spend more time with him. I saw him less at home. He was always out with Michelangelo, and the rains began to fall more frequently, as if the weather reflected the change in his life. It was one afternoon, just as the sky darkened inexplicably, that Kleiber returned from one such walk, more distant and taciturn than ever. The storm was at its peak, and the rain was pounding hard on the windows of the house. I had gone out to do some shopping when I returned, and saw Kleiber sitting on the couch, staring blankly. He was soaked, not only from the rain, but also from something else I couldn't identify. I felt a shiver run down my spine at the sight of him like that, as if he had changed before my eyes. At first I ignored it, thinking that the rain had left him exhausted, but I couldn't help but feel a growing uneasiness inside me. It was then that I realized something that had been going unnoticed in my mind. Kleiber was no longer the same. His eyes, once bright, now showed an empty, absent look. The addiction everyone was whispering about in the neighborhood was not just a rumor. Kleiber had fallen, and it was not something he could ignore. The rain wouldn't stop falling, as if the sky itself was lamenting what was happening. I decided to confront him that very night, under the storm that was lashing the house, as well as the storm brewing inside him. When I asked him what was wrong, Kleiber looked at me without saying a word. His lips were trembling, and I felt my heart clench as I saw the despair reflected on his face. Suddenly, as if he couldn't take it anymore, he jumped up and ran to his room, closing the door behind him. I tried to talk to him, but only heard his gasping for breath. The storm outside was intensifying. That night, like many others, Kleiber disappeared again, leaving without saying where he was going. I looked for him everywhere, but it was too late. The storm never let up. The rain never stopped falling, and with it, little by little, the brother I knew was crumbling. As the days passed, Michelangelo became a constant shadow in Kleiber's life, dragging him further and further into the abyss. And though Kleiber tried to hide it, I knew that the marks of his addiction were beginning to become more evident. On one occasion, I found him in a park, soaked to the bone, under a gray, rain-laden sky. His face was unfocused, and his eyes, normally full of energy, were now empty. I walked over to him, took his hand and stared at him. "Kleiber, what are you doing?" I asked him in a firm voice. He simply let out a nervous laugh but said nothing. By now it was clear that the addiction had him irreversibly trapped. The rain was still falling, and the air was charged with an unbearable sadness. I remember one day, after weeks of not hearing from him, he returned home in the wee hours of the morning. The sound of rain woke him up, but it was one of those storms that seemed to announce the end of the world. I got up, worried, and as I went to the hallway, I saw his shadow in the doorway. He was standing, trembling, soaking wet, his eyes red from crying. But what struck me most was his face. It was no longer my brother's. It was the face of a stranger. "Uriel, I don't know if I can do it anymore," he told me in a broken voice, but still full of pride. "Don't worry, this is all my fault," he added before skidding off into the hallway. At that instant, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The days passed and the rains never stopped. The storm grew fiercer, as did Kleiber's internal struggles. We tried to get him to go to detox centers, but every time there seemed to be a glimmer of hope, everything fell apart again. The arguments became constant, and the sleepless nights, worrying about his life, dragged on like the storm battering our windows. One day, the call I dreaded came. An unknown man on the other end of the line informed me that Kleiber had been found on a street, passed out and surrounded by the rain that fell relentlessly on him. The voice on the other end of the line seemed distant, but as I listened, something inside me snapped. I rushed to the hospital, but by the time I arrived, it was too late. Kleiber had been through hell, the likes of which no one could have imagined. The storm had washed him away, and he, already exhausted by it all, could take no more. That day, the rain never stopped, as if the sky was crying for him, for us. When Kleiber died, the air seemed thicker than ever, as if the storm had reached its peak. It was a loss I could never quite process, because I still wondered if I had done enough, if I had seen the signs in time. But all that remained was the echo of his name, washed away by the rain and the wind, and a sense of emptiness settling in my chest. Today, after all, I still feel the storm. The rain has never stopped falling on my heart, reminding me that sometimes, no matter how hard you try to save someone, you can't fight that person's inner storm. No matter how many times you try to rescue someone who is unwilling to save themselves, the storm will continue, and the rains will keep falling, and so will the memories. My name is Sergio, and I have lived more than 30 years in the same city. But recently I discovered something that changed my life forever. Something that was in my hands for years, without me knowing it. I have decided to write this story, although it is hard for me to share it. The object in question was a diary, a very old one, with a worn leather cover and yellowed pages. Inside, it hid a secret that I was not prepared to face. I remember the day I found it. I was cleaning out the storage room of my grandparents' house, a large house that had been left empty after their death. No one had touched anything since, and time seemed to have stood still in every corner of the house. While going through a box full of things I had collected from my grandparents' lives, I found a small diary bound in brown leather. The cover was nearly shredded, and the rusted metal clasp seemed to have stood the test of time. It wasn't the first time I had found old items in the storage room, but something about that journal caught my attention. I took it in my hands, and without thinking too much about it, I put it in my backpack. There was something about its appearance that made me uneasy, as if it was watching me, as if that object had something to tell me. I didn't open it immediately, but curiosity ran through my veins. My mind kept imagining what secrets those pages could hide. When I got home, I left it on the dining room table and sat down to read it. At first, I didn't understand much. The first pages were full of sentences without much sense, fragments of thoughts that seemed to be written by someone who was tormented by something. It was clear that the person who wrote those pages was not in his right mind. But as I read on, I began to notice something strange. The dates in the diary corresponded to a period when my mother was young, even before she was born, which I found curious. My mother had never spoken of her youth, let alone what seemed to be a relationship she had never mentioned a word about. In the following pages, the diary became more specific. The writer spoke of a man named Andrew, a name that sounded familiar. It was a name my mother used to mention in her conversations with her friends when she was still living with us. Andres, according to what I read in the diary, was a man with a dark presence, a piercing gaze, and a deep voice. In the first few pages, the diary talked about how they met, how their relationship began as a harmless friendship, but soon turned into something much more complex and dangerous. At first, I didn't think much of it. I thought it was a simple story of lost love, something common in youth. But as I read on, things became more disturbing. The writer spoke of secret meetings in dark places, how Andrew seemed to know all his secrets, how he managed to manipulate the minds of those around him. There was a sense of anguish in every word, as if the writer was trapped in an endless nightmare. The tone of the diary became more somber with each page. It was then that I read something that left me transfixed. On one of the last pages, the writer mentioned a photograph that showed a man and a woman embracing, with a smile that seemed forced, as if they were both hiding something. But what really shook me was the last line on that page. "This is the last time I will see that photo. Today I will destroy it, even if it means I will lose a part of me." The mention of a photograph made me think of something. Somehow, I felt that photograph had to do with something about my mother. Maybe there was something she never told me, something she didn't want me to know. With my heart pounding, I got up from the table and looked in the drawer where I kept the family photographs. At first I found nothing, but my intuition told me that the picture was somewhere. A few minutes passed, until at the bottom of the box, I found what I was looking for. It was a black and white photograph, of mediocre quality, showing two people embracing. My mother, and a man I didn't recognize. My pulse raced as I looked at the image. It was the same scene the newspaper had described, the same forced smile, the same sense of unease. The man in the picture was Andres. I couldn't be wrong. My mother had been young, and perhaps that relationship had marked a turning point in her life. The question was, why had she never told me about him? And why had she hidden that photograph for so many years? My mind was spinning. I decided to investigate further. The diary mentioned that the photograph should be destroyed, but something told me I shouldn't let it go. I went back to the storage room, where I had found the diary, and looked for something else. I found a small wooden box in a corner, almost forgotten. When I opened it, I found a recording on a cassette tape. I didn't know what was on it, but something told me I had to listen to it. That night, with the tape recorder in hand, I sat alone in my living room. The rain was pounding the windows hard, and the wind was shrieking outside. It was as if the weather had also allied itself with my concerns. I inserted the tape and listened to it. At first, there was only static noise, followed by mumbling. But little by little, a man's voice became clearer. It was Andres. His voice was low, authoritative, and he spoke about something that made my blood run cold. The content of the recording was disturbing. Andres was talking about how he had managed to manipulate my mother, how he had dragged her into a dangerous game, one that she could not escape. He said he was willing to do anything to get what he wanted, and mentioned the importance of the photograph, which had to be destroyed at all costs. The recording cut off abruptly, leaving an empty feeling in the air. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an old recording. Maybe my mother was being manipulated by someone else in her youth. But something deep inside me told me that I had to do something else, that this story didn't end there. I decided to confront my mother. When I showed her the photograph and told her about what I had found, her face changed immediately. It was not the reaction I expected. Instead of being surprised, she looked as if she had been waiting for that moment. His eyes filled with sadness, and he asked me to stop looking for more. She told me about Andrew, how she knew him when she was young, how she fell in love with him, but she also told me about the terror she felt every time she met him. She confessed to me that it had been a toxic relationship, in which Andres had manipulated her for years, until she finally escaped. The photograph, which had been hidden in a drawer, was the final piece of that story. It was her memory of a love that had been darker than anyone could imagine. What struck me most was when my mother told me that she had never wanted me to know the truth. She had feared that in discovering the story, it might destroy what we had built as a family. She asked me to put the past behind me, to stop looking for things that no longer mattered. The rain was still coming down hard, and my mind was flooded with conflicting thoughts. What I had discovered was not something I could ignore. The story of my mother, of Andrew, of the photograph and the diary, was something that would haunt me forever. But I also understood something. Some stories are better kept in the past, where they can't hurt us anymore. At least that's what I try to believe. The diary, the photograph, and the recording were now tucked away in a drawer, along with the memories I no longer wanted to face. The secret had been revealed, but the storm it had unleashed never seemed to want to cease. My name is Hector, and I have been working as a policeman in this city for more than 10 years. I have seen many things that can be described as strange, although I have always tried not to get carried away by the irrational. Work is what occupies me most, and over the years, I have learned to ignore things that have no logical explanation. But there is something that happened one night, an encounter that made me question everything I had believed up to that point. It was a cold night, darker than usual. The city seemed to be eerily silent. The streetlights reflected an orange hue on the streets wet from the recent rain. I was patrolling with my partner, a newly assigned officer named Luis. We were taking the night shift, which usually represented nothing out of the ordinary. But that night, something in the air was different. We received a distress call near an industrial area, a place we don't often visit. When we arrived, we found a man in custody, an inmate, who had been causing a disturbance. Apparently the man had been arrested for robbing a local store, but what really caught our attention was his strange behavior. He was calm, too calm for someone who had just been arrested. The way he was looking at us, with a vacant expression, was not that of a normal man. I decided it would be best to take him quickly to the police station. We loaded the inmate into the patrol car, and as soon as we settled into our seats, the man began to speak. His voice was soft, almost as if his words carried no weight, but there was something unsettling in his tone. At first, I thought he was simply trying to get something off his chest, but I soon realized that what he was saying was not commonplace. He began to narrate events that he himself didn't seem to fully understand. There was something dark in his story, something that didn't add up. He said that in the last few weeks, he had been following a sign. According to him, the sign had led him to steal and to do things he did not understand. He said he heard voices, that he saw figures in the shadows, and that everything he had done was part of a plan. I didn't understand it at first, but the more he talked, the more uncomfortable I became. There was something in his words that chilled my blood. At first, I thought he was simply a deranged man, someone who had lost touch with reality. But as the trip progressed, the man continued with his story, detailing things that somehow felt all too accurate. He talked about the history of the city, mentioning places and events that should not be known to anyone but a local. He described events that happened years ago, unexplained deaths, disappearances, as if he was privy to secrets that even the police didn't know about. One of the stories he mentioned was particularly disturbing. He said there was a place in town, an old abandoned building that people avoided. No one knew exactly what had happened there, but he claimed that the place was at the heart of everything bad that had happened in the city. According to him, the building had not only witnessed numerous crimes, but had been the scene of macabre rituals performed by a cult that had been operating in the shadows for years. The way he said it, with a terrifying calmness, made me feel that perhaps this was not just a delusion. Every word seemed to carry weight, as if the man really knew what he was saying. I tried to play it down, thinking it was just another case of someone with psychological problems, but something told me I should pay attention. The man, who had introduced himself as Alejandro, continued his monologue. He talked about how faceless men were everywhere, that they were always watching, controlling, manipulating events from the shadows. He referred to these figures as if he knew them closely, as if he had some personal relationship with them. He said that the voices he heard told him that his role in this game was crucial, that he had to do terrible things for the cycle to be fulfilled. The road leading to the police station seemed to never end. With every kilometer, the tension in the air felt thicker, as if the night itself was coming to life. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw Alejandro, motionless, watching me without blinking. His eyes, empty before, now seemed more intense, more alert. There was something strange in his behavior, something that I could not decipher, but that kept me alert. At one point he began to laugh. It wasn't a nervous laugh, but a low, macabre laugh. "I know what you're thinking, officers," he said. "You think I'm crazy. You think I'm delusional. But I assure you this is all real. Everything that has happened in this city is connected. You know it, even if you don't understand it yet." My partner Luis, who was behind the wheel, began to look nervously in the rearview mirror. Alejandro's laughter was getting more and more spaced out, as if he had no control over himself. I asked Luis to speed up, to get out of that area as soon as possible. The atmosphere in the air was strange, as if something was about to happen. I didn't know if it was fear taking hold of me, or if there was really something behind the inmate's words. As we got closer to the police station, Alejandro's words became more incoherent, more chaotic. He started talking about sacrifices, about blood, about things I found impossible to believe. He said that the faceless men were going to do something that would change the city forever. He said that he was the key to unlocking everything, that his arrest was not an accident, but part of a bigger plan. When we finally arrived at the police station, the atmosphere felt heavier. The other officers looked at us curiously, but I couldn't stop thinking about Alejandro's words. He was saying that everything he had done was necessary to fulfill a greater purpose, a purpose of which I was but a bystander. I left it up to the other officers, but something inside me told me that this was not the end of the story. Over the next few days, I researched everything Alexander had said. I looked for the building he was talking about. I researched the cults, the rituals. What I discovered left me cold. I couldn't find concrete proof, but I did find strange coincidences with some of the darker events in the city. Unexplained deaths, disappearances without a trace. It all seemed to fit together, but in such a strange way that I couldn't explain it. Today, after all, I still wonder if Alejandro's words were simply the delirium of a disturbed man, or if in reality, there is something much darker operating in the shadows. Every time I pass through the industrial zone, or when I walk near certain places in the city, I can't help but feel that something is watching me. And I can't get out of my mind the last look Alejandro gave me before he was arrested. A look that said more than I will ever dare to understand. My name is Raul, and I never imagined that on that day, in the pouring rain and with the city in a thick fog, my life would take a dark turn. I work as a receptionist in an old hostel in the center of the city. The place is away from the urban bustle, but still welcomes tourists looking for a bit of calm before continuing their journey. That night, as the rain hammered the roof and windows of the hostel, a figure appeared on the threshold of the door, a visitor who would leave me forever marked. It was close to 10 o'clock at night when the sound of the storm began to intensify. The drops were hitting the glass of the entrance with force, and the wind made the lights of the hostel flicker from time to time. The water was falling as if there was no end to it, covering the landscape outside the windows with a layer of gray mist. I was sitting behind the counter, looking at the clock, when I saw a shadow appear at the entrance. I didn't think much of it. There was always someone who was late, but there was something strange about that figure, something that made me doubt my thoughts. The man entered without making a sound. He was soaked from the rain, wearing a long coat that clung to his body like a second skin. His face was almost hidden under the hood, but what I could see of his eyes made me uneasy. They were cold, like two stones plunged in darkness, empty of expression. His pace was slow, almost calculated, and as he approached the counter, I felt a strange pressure in the air. I stood up to greet him, as I always did, but the man did not respond. Instead, he just stared at the register on the counter, looking for the book where we listed our guests. His silence grew thicker as time passed. Finally, he spoke, but his voice was low, as if it were a whisper carried by the wind. He asked me for a room for one night only. Although I was surprised that someone would arrive so late, I saw no reason to hesitate. I handed him the key to a room on the top floor, away from the other rooms. The man thanked me with a barely perceptible gesture and turned around, leaving without another word. As the minutes passed, my sense of unease grew. The rain continued to fall heavily, and I wondered if the man had come just to escape the bad weather, or if there was something else behind his arrival. I decided to ignore him, as I usually did with most guests who seemed to have something strange about them. After all, we all have our stories, our secrets. But as the night wore on, the air grew heavier and heavier. The lights kept flickering with each bolt of lightning that lit up the sky, and the sound of wind and rain hitting the walls of the inn filled the space. The calm of the place was broken by the sound of footsteps on the stairs. I looked toward the entrance, but the clock read midnight, and there was no one who had arrived after the strange man. I don't know why, but something pulled me away from the counter and upstairs. At first, I thought it was an intuition, something as faint as a whisper in my mind, but the higher I climbed, the more uncomfortable I became. The storm seemed to hit harder, and the shadows in the corridor on the top floor grew longer with every spark of lightning. As I arrived in front of the door to the man's room, I felt an uncomfortable pressure in my chest. The door was ajar, and somehow, I couldn't help but feel that something wasn't right. There was no ringing of the doorbell, not even the sound of the man's breathing inside. It just stood there, silent. I pushed open the door, and instantly, the coldness of the room enveloped me. Everything was in its place, but something made me shiver. There was no sign of the man. His coat was lying on the bed, soaked from the rain, but he was gone. I looked around, searching for some sign of his presence, something that would give me some clue as to where he had gone. But there was nothing. Only the sound of the storm coming in through the open window, which let the cold air escape into the room. Suddenly, I heard a rustling in the hallway, as if someone was walking nearby. I turned around but saw no one. The air was getting heavier and heavier, as if the place was saturated with an invisible tension. I decided to go down quickly, not because I was afraid, but because the atmosphere felt more and more suffocating. But something stopped me. Before I reached the staircase, a shadow crossed before my eyes. The figure of the man, in his soaked coat, appeared again in the doorway. I did not understand how he had gotten there without my hearing him. I did not see his footsteps or hear the sound of his entrance. He simply stood in front of me, his face now more visible in the lamplight. His expression was vacant, but the eyes shone with an intensity I could not describe. It was not the look of someone afraid of the storm or of being alone. It was a fixed, determined look, as if everything around was irrelevant to him. He took a step toward me, and I felt as if the space between us narrowed. Suddenly his voice, soft and cold, cut through the air with one word. "Do you know what's in this place?" I didn't answer, because something in his tone told me I shouldn't speak. The sense of danger was as real as the rain beating against the windows. But the worst was when, with a slight movement, the man walked past me, without another word. It only left me with the feeling that something dark and deep was hidden behind his presence, something I never understood. That night I could not sleep. The storm did not cease, and the sound of the wind seemed to increase the tension I felt in my body. As soon as dawn came, I got up early and checked every corner of the hotel, but the man was gone. The room was empty. The soaked coat was no longer on the bed. Only the echo of his presence remained, that shadow that I never managed to understand. Days passed, but I could never forget that night. Something inside me told me that the man was not really gone. I felt his gaze haunting me, as if his shadow had remained in the hostel, waiting for the right moment to return. As the months passed, the hostel was never the same. No one else saw the Rain Man, but things changed inexplicably. Guests began to talk of strange noises at night, of doors closing on their own, and of an atmosphere that grew heavier the longer they stayed inside. Some even stopped coming back. The place was shrouded in mystery, and I, even today, can't help but wonder if that man was part of something bigger, something that I will never understand, but that somehow still lurks in the walls of the old inn, waiting for the next storm. My name is Taylor, and over the years I have learned to live with fear. I have faced difficult situations, some extreme, but nothing prepared me for what happened a few months ago. An event that began as an unimportant phone call, a banal event, ended up being an experience that marked me forever. That call not only ruined my life for a while, but also taught me that the closest people, the ones you think you know, are the ones that can plunge you into the abyss without warning. It was a rainy night, one of those that seem endless, where the sound of the storm mixes with the hum of the wind, and the darkness seems to swallow everything around it. The day had been normal, like any other. After a long day's work, I arrived home exhausted and eager to rest. My apartment was quiet, and the feeling of peace was all I needed to disconnect from the outside world. My idea was to watch a movie and relax. I didn't expect the normalcy of my life to be interrupted by a phone call. The phone rang around 11 o'clock at night, The ringing echoed in the stillness of my home. At the time, the ringing seemed more of a nuisance than a real concern. I picked it up without thinking too much. At first, I only heard heavy breathing, as if someone was waiting for me to speak first. As soon as I was about to ask who it was, the raspy, almost whispery voice filtered through the earpiece. Taylor. The voice was unmistakable, and, at the same time, strangely alien. I could recognize the tone, though I didn't understand why it sounded so familiar. I didn't know what to do, and before I could formulate a response, the call abruptly cut off. The silence that followed was overwhelming. Something inside me told me that this call was different. At first, I tried to rationalize it, but the discomfort that came over me was too intense to let go. I looked at the phone, searching for some sign that would give me a clue as to who was on the other end. But the number that came up was unknown. Not knowing what to do, I put the phone aside and tried to resume the movie, but the uneasy feeling still lingered. The sound of the storm outside my window seemed to amplify the nightmare that was already beginning to form in my mind. I thought maybe it was a joke, one of those practical jokes that you never know who is playing, but there was something about that voice that wouldn't leave me alone. The night continued, and when I had almost managed to relax again, the phone rang again. The same pattern: breath, pause, and then the same voice, now with an even stranger tone. Do you remember me? The words chilled me. My mind began to process the possibilities, and the figure of Susanna, my ex-girlfriend, crept into my thoughts. Would it be her? I didn't understand. Susanna and I had ended our relationship a few months ago, but the breakup had been cordial, almost amicable. There was no apparent reason for someone like her, who had always been so rational, to do something like that. However, upon hearing those words, a shadow of doubt began to settle inside me. The next few days became a constant nightmare. The calls continued, always at the same time, always with the same breath, the same question. Fear began to take hold of me, like a thick fog that covered everything. I didn't know if the person on the other end of the line was pulling my leg, or if there was something more sinister behind it all. No one took me seriously when I told them about the calls. They thought I was exaggerating, that it was just a joke. One afternoon, while I was checking my email, something terrifying happened. I found a message that completely froze me. The content was sparse, but direct. Have you forgotten about me so quickly? What you are hearing is not a mistake. There is no turning back. You will pay for what you did. The signature at the end was clear. S. Susanna. She didn't need any more proof. There was no more room for doubt. The calls, the messages, everything had a single purpose. Something terrible had begun, and I didn't know how to stop it. My life changed completely. The nights became endless. Every time the phone rang, I was paralyzed. Fear became a shadow that followed me around the house. Memories of Susanna, of what we had been, mingled with the terror of what I was living through. Uncertainty consumed me. What did I want from myself? Why was I doing this? I tried to do what anyone would do in a situation like this: change my phone number. But to my horror, the calls kept coming. No matter what I did, there was no escaping this unseen presence that stalked me. The anguish was taking over, and it began to interfere with everything I did. I could no longer sleep peacefully or concentrate on my work. The feeling of being watched, of being persecuted, tormented me constantly. One afternoon, as I was returning home from work, I felt that something was not right. That feeling of being watched had grown to unbearable levels. At first, I thought it was just paranoia, but that same evening, as I was walking back from the car to my apartment, I saw someone. A dark figure who vanished instantly. I turned around to make sure it wasn't my imagination, but the figure quickly disappeared, leaving no trace. It was then that I decided to seek help. I hired a private detective with experience in this type of case. I had to know what was going on. The detective began to investigate the phone number and the calls, and it was he who gave me the answer I had never imagined. Susanna had hired a man, someone she had had contact with during her youth, to harass me. During our relationship, she had begun to show signs of jealousy and obsession. At first, I thought it was part of her personality, but now I understood that something much darker was brewing inside her. After our breakup, she was not able to let me go. The grudge she had built up for everything we couldn't save turned into hatred, and in her twisted mind, the only thing left was revenge. The man I had hired was an expert at creating fear and anguish, and for weeks, he had been silently stalking me, not letting me rest for a single day. The calls, the messages, the constant feeling of being watched, it was all part of his plan. The detective showed me proof of the payments Susanna had made, and I was speechless. I could not believe it. The person I had loved, the one I had shared so much with, had been responsible for turning my life into a living hell. There was no turning back. My trust in people had been shattered. With evidence in hand, I managed to report Susanna. However, although the calls stopped, the damage had been done. The fear I had experienced, the constant paranoia, did not disappear immediately. The image of Susanna, transformed into the figure of hatred and revenge, was never erased from my mind. The scariest thing of all was not the harassment itself, but the realization of what people are capable of when they let resentment and obsession take over. The calls stopped, but the scar on my soul would remain forever. The story of those anonymous calls will go down as one of the most disturbing of my life, and it has taught me that you never know what is really going on in the minds of the people closest to you. My name is Alejandro, and the story I'm about to tell you is one that I never thought I would live, much less that I would ever be willing to tell. It is not a story of disappearance by natural causes or of some tragedy, but a story of betrayal, of mistrust, and of the fracture of what I once believed to be my family. The disappearance of my daughter, Carla, has marked a before and after in my life. And though the days pass, the memories remain, and the pain never goes away. She was my only daughter, my reason to go on. I had her with Clara, my wife, whom I met when we were both young, full of dreams and promises. We loved each other, or so I thought, and I always thought we were a united family, a family that would never be broken by anything or anyone. But like everything in life, things don't always turn out the way you expect them to. She grew up happily, always full of energy and curiosity about the world. As she grew older, small differences began to emerge between my wife and me. I couldn't say at what exact moment it all started to fall apart, but it did. The disagreements became more frequent, the arguments more intense, and the love that once united us began to fade. However, despite our differences, we always tried to keep Carla from witnessing our fights. We protected her from it all, or so we thought. She was 18 when everything started to change. One night, after Clara and I had a particularly loud argument, Carla decided to go out with her friends without telling us where she was going. At first, I thought it was just typical teenage rebellion, but what I didn't know at the time was that this outing would mark the beginning of something much bigger. Days passed, then weeks, and I didn't come home as often. He always had an excuse, a reason for not returning on time, but his attitude had changed drastically. She became more distant, more evasive. I would try to talk to her, to understand what was going on, but all I got were curt answers, or sometimes not even that. Clara and I didn't know what to do, and our concern for our daughter grew more and more. One night, however, everything came to a head. Carla disappeared without a trace. She left the house with her backpack, as she always did, but this time she didn't come back. Not a call, not a message, nothing. Clara and I tried to stay calm, thinking that she was staying at a friend's house, or that maybe she had decided to spend the night out. But the hours passed and the worry turned into despair. The next morning, when the sun had not yet risen, I decided to go to the police. I filed a report, but I knew something wasn't right. This was no ordinary disappearance. Something told me that this time it was different. The police started the search, but they found no relevant clues in the first few hours. No one knew anything about her, not her friends, not her schoolmates. It was then that I began to receive the first signs that something much darker was going on. For days, Clara and I received anonymous calls, always with the same scratchy voice on the other end. "They'll find her soon," they would say. "The time for lies is about to end." I didn't understand anything, but something told me those words weren't just an empty threat. I couldn't help thinking that there was something behind all this, something I didn't want to see. At first, I didn't want to involve anyone else. I didn't want people to know what we were going through, the pain of not knowing what had happened to our daughter. But when the official search didn't bear fruit, I began to investigate on my own. There was something that told me that Carla had not left of her own free will. It wasn't a runaway. It wasn't an escape. Something else was going on, and I was willing to find out, even if I didn't realize what I was facing. It was on one of those days of solitary searching, when I was going through his belongings, that I found something that completely froze me. In the bottom of his backpack, under his clothes, I found a sealed envelope. When I opened it, I found a letter. It was not a love letter, not a goodbye. It was a letter my daughter had written, but had never had the chance to send me. The words on the paper were cold, distant, but also filled with a deep sadness. In the letter, Carla confessed to me that she had discovered something about Clara, something her mother had been hiding for years, a truth so dark that it had made her make an irrevocable decision. Carla had discovered that Clara had been involved in something much bigger than I could have imagined. A lie that had been years in the making and involved betrayal of our family, of our trust. I couldn't believe what I was reading, but the evidence was right in front of me. Clara had never told me the truth, and my daughter, upon discovering it, had decided to escape, to get away from everything, as if that could protect her from a reality she was not willing to face. The letter ended with a sentence that tore me apart. "I can't live with the lie anymore, Dad. I need to find my own truth, and maybe that means losing you too." It was impossible to comprehend the pain I felt reading those words. My daughter was gone not only because she had run away from home, but because she had discovered the truth behind everything we had been through, and I couldn't bear it. I knew that if she returned, everything would be different, that she would no longer be able to look me in the eye in the same way. But I also understood that Carla's decision was greater than the fear I felt. She had chosen to leave to find peace, to get away from a family broken by lies and secrets. The search continued, but the police failed to find her. No one saw her, no one knew her, as if she had disappeared into thin air. Over the months, Claire and I tried to rebuild what was left of our relationship, but the void our daughter left in our lives was unbearable. She never returned, and although the security forces assured us that they would keep looking, we knew that deep down, what was really missing was not a clue, but the will to confront what we had done, what we had allowed. Today, Carla remains an absence, a name whispered in the cold nights, an echo in an empty house. Some tell me she is out there, that maybe someday she will return, but I know she will not. And though every day I try to move forward, to find some way to live without the shadow of her disappearance haunting me, I know I will never be the same. The betrayal not only robbed me of my daughter, it robbed me of the chance to be the father she needed. My daughter, she is no longer in this world we once shared, but her words live on in me. Perhaps her decision was the last attempt to find the truth, and even though her escape shattered me, I know that, somewhere, she found what she was looking for. My name is Gabriel, and although I have always thought of office life as monotonous, I never imagined it would become the setting for something so dark. What happened inside those four walls haunts me every day, and although I have tried to bury it deep in my memory, there are nights when I see it all clearly, as if it were happening again in front of me. I worked in an accounting firm in the center of the city, a place with rigid schedules, strict rules, and where personal relationships always took a back seat. It wasn't the most welcoming environment, but it served its purpose. Among the unwritten rules of the place was a very clear one. No romantic relationships between colleagues were allowed. The manager used to say that it could complicate things, distract employees, and generate conflicts. It was a rule we all respected, or at least we thought we did. I remember that morning started like any other. The rain was pounding against the office windows, creating a constant murmur that was almost soothing. I had arrived early to review some reports and prepare a presentation for the weekly meeting. The office was almost empty, except for a couple of colleagues who had also arrived earlier than usual. Among them were Antonella and Luis. Antonella was one of the most reserved employees in the office, always professional, always discreet. She didn't talk much about her personal life, but she was efficient in her work and got along well with everyone. Luis, on the other hand, was the typical charismatic man. He had a way of connecting with people, but also a certain intensity in his gaze that was sometimes uncomfortable. I had never stopped to think too much about them, but now I understand that maybe I should have. As I was concentrating on my tasks, I heard a murmur coming from the file room, a small room down the hall where old documents were kept. At first, I didn't think anything of it. I assumed someone was talking on the phone or checking something. However, as the minutes passed, the murmurs became louder, more agitated. I got up from my desk and walked down the hall. The door to the file room was ajar, and from where I stood, I could see the shadows of two people moving quickly. I stopped, hesitating whether I should approach or not. It was then that I heard a thud, something that made me stop my breathing. My body reacted before my mind could process it, and I moved a little closer. I looked through the crack in the door, and what I saw left me paralyzed. Luis was standing, his breathing agitated, his hands shaking. In front of him, on the floor, lay Antonella. Her body was motionless, and around her, a dark stain was beginning to spread on the floor. The knife Luis was holding glowed under the fluorescent light. My whole body tensed, and I felt as if time stood still. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I didn't understand what had happened, but the scene in front of me was clear. Luis had killed Antonella. There was no doubt about it. My mind began to fill with questions, but all I could do was stand still, watching, unable to move or make a sound. Luis raised his head and looked around, as if he was making sure no one had seen him. I closed my eyes for a moment, praying he wouldn't spot me. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid he might hear it. After what seemed like an eternity, I saw him leave the room, wiping his hands on his shirt and closing the door behind him. I stood there, motionless, waiting for the sound of his footsteps to disappear. When I finally mustered the courage to enter the room, I did so on shaky legs. Antonella's body was still there, and the scene was so devastating that I felt a knot in my stomach. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to call the police, but then I thought about what it would mean. If I said anything, Luis would know it was me who had ratted him out. I was terrified at the thought of becoming his next target. Besides, the office had cameras in the hallways. If I was there, it was likely that they had already recorded my presence near the file room. I left the room as quickly as I could, trying not to make a sound. I returned to my desk and stood there, shaking, unable to concentrate on anything. My mind was in complete chaos. The morning continued as if nothing had happened, and when the others arrived, the office routine returned to normal. But I knew nothing was right. Hours later, someone found Antonella's body. Panic gripped the office, and the police arrived to investigate. Luis, in his ability to manipulate people, pretended to be as shocked and devastated as everyone else. No one suspected him. He had cleaned up the scene in such a way that no obvious traces were left to connect him to the crime. The investigation went nowhere, and the case remained unsolved. I kept silent. Every day I tortured myself with guilt, but also with fear. I knew Luis was capable of anything, and I was not willing to risk my life. However, every time I saw him in the office, every time he spoke to me with his friendly tone and fake smile, I felt as if a dark shadow enveloped me. He knew that I knew, and although he never said anything directly, his look told me everything. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I quit my job and moved to another city, seeking to escape that unbearable weight. But even now, hundreds of miles away, the image of Antonella on the floor and Luis's cold gaze continue to haunt me. I don't know if I will ever find peace, but one thing is for sure. Silence can be as terrifying as the crime itself. The story I am about to tell begins in a faraway place, where the air is thicker and the sun seems always off, as if something is about to happen, but will never come. The city where I was born and grew up has a peculiarity. It is as if time were trapped in an endless cycle. Everything seems to be in its place, but the shadows, the absences, the murmurs make it impossible to really feel at home. My name is Esteban Vega, and my life was always pretty quiet until I decided to join a new company operating on the outskirts of the city. I had heard about it through rumors, but I didn't pay much attention to it. The money was good, the job was promising, and, honestly, I was looking for something different for a change of pace. What I didn't know was that by taking that step, I was setting in motion a series of events that would change my life forever. The company was located in an industrial complex on the outskirts, a gray, lonely building surrounded by empty fields and desolate roads. It wasn't a busy place. There weren't many employees, and the walls of the place looked like they had seen better days. No one talked much about what they were doing there, but in interviews, it was mentioned to us that the project was cutting edge, something that would change the rules of the industry. It all sounded so promising and secretive that I couldn't resist. When I arrived, I was assigned to a small team led by someone named Ignacio. He was a man with a strong character, with a fixed and somewhat unsettling gaze, but at the same time he exuded a kind of calm authority that made me trust him. The first few days were quiet. Everything seemed to run like any other company. However, I soon noticed something strange in the atmosphere. There was something about the way everyone behaved, an attitude of constant alertness, as if they were waiting for something that never happened, but which they always felt was going to happen. People didn't look relaxed. Rather, it seemed as if the company was slowly consuming them. One of my colleagues, Alexander, told me about the meetings they were having with the company's top executives. He said that no one knew exactly what kind of investigations they were conducting, but that something big was brewing. I couldn't help but think about the tense air in those hallways, the whispered conversations and the furtive glances. As time went on, I began to participate in the meetings that seemed to be the most secretive, always under the promise that I couldn't talk to anyone outside the company about what was going on there. And that, strange as it seemed, was just what I needed to feel part of something important. One day, after a particularly long meeting, I was left alone in the building. I wanted to review some reports before going home, so I went up to the second floor, where the main offices were located. The place was quiet, and although it was late in the afternoon, there was something eerie about the stillness. I walked down the hallway and suddenly heard a noise coming from one of the rooms. Intrigued, I crept closer, hoping to see one of my companions. But when I reached the door, something made me stop. Through the crack in the door, I could see Ignacio, my team leader, in a heated discussion with two people I didn't recognize. His gestures were aggressive, as if he were defending something, but what surprised me most was the tone of the conversation. I didn't understand what they were saying, but there was something in the air, something dark, that made me feel I shouldn't be there. I felt a pang in my stomach, a sense that I had crossed an invisible line. What I saw was too much for my mind. I closed the door cautiously and walked away quickly. I didn't know what I had witnessed, but something inside me told me I had to get away from it all. The next day, things were no longer the same. The gazes of my companions had become colder, more calculating, as if they knew something I did not. It didn't take me long to realize that everyone seemed to be involved in something that I didn't understand, but that left me out. Alexander, one of the few I could talk to, warned me. He said he had seen things, that in fact not everything in the company was what it seemed. He told me of an experiment, of tests that could not be leaked to the outside world, of a project that was beyond anything we imagined. But what disturbed me most was the look on his face when he told me, as if he was about to lose control. I began to investigate on my own, taking a closer look at every move in the company. As the days passed, the paranoia grew. The building seemed to become more claustrophobic, the walls thicker. I felt as if someone was constantly watching me. I didn't understand why, but something inside me knew I wasn't safe there. One afternoon, I decided to confront Ignacio. I needed to know what was going on, what was being hidden, why everything in the company was falling apart before my eyes. I approached his office, but something stopped me. The door was ajar, and I could hear his voice, speaking to someone on the phone. He was saying something about a final solution and the full report. I felt a shiver run through my body. What was he talking about? What kind of final solution? That same night, I decided to leave the company. I couldn't stay there another minute. But when I got home, I found something I wasn't expecting. A letter on my desk. There was no sender, just my name and handwriting. When I opened it, the words were clear. "We are watching you. Do not try to run away." Panic took hold of me. I tried to get out of the city, but as I did, something strange happened. Every time I took a different route, it seemed as if fate was taking me back to the same place, as if it was trapping me in an endless cycle. Days passed, then weeks, and I could never get out of that maze. Fear had me trapped. To this day, I don't know what really happened. Questions still haunt my mind. Was it an experiment, a game, or something much more sinister? What I do know is that what happened there will never have clear answers. No one talks about it, no one knows anything. And I, for one, keep wondering if I'll ever find a way out. The day it all began, the rain was falling like an impenetrable wall over the city. From my small downtown apartment, the world seemed reduced to the blurred lights of street lamps and the incessant pounding of water against the windows. I had gone weeks without any significant progress in my work, and the weariness of long days at the newspaper was beginning to take its toll. That night, however, something arrived that would change my life forever. It was an envelope with no return address, slipped under my door. I hadn't heard anyone outside, but there it was. An ordinary manila envelope, slightly damp from condensation. Inside, I found a few printed sheets, some blurry photographs, and a handwritten note that read, "Follow the eagle's trail. You are closer than you think." I didn't understand the message at the time, but what I did recognize was the logo printed on one of the sheets. It was from a private security company that, according to rumors, had shady ties to the government. My curiosity was immediately piqued, and I began to review each document carefully. There were references to million-dollar government contracts, classified operations, and, most disturbingly, names of missing persons who seemed related to these activities. It wasn't the first time I had received strange leads, but something about these documents made me think I had stumbled onto something big. I decided to investigate, starting with the names on the lists. Some were journalists, others activists or former government officials. All had disappeared under suspicious circumstances in recent years. The information was fragmentary, like loose pieces of a puzzle, but one thing was clear. Someone was playing a very dangerous game, and I had been drawn into it. I spent the next few days in a constant state of paranoia. Every time I left the apartment, I felt eyes on my back. On the subway, the cars seemed to fill with expressionless faces staring at me more than necessary. At the newsroom, my computer started behaving strangely. Windows popped up and disappeared for no reason, and some files became corrupted without explanation. Then came the text messages. They were short, cryptic, and always from unknown numbers. Some said things like, "Stop searching or you can't win." Others included coordinates that, when I researched them, led me to desolate places. An abandoned warehouse, an empty parking lot, even an old factory on the outskirts of town. I didn't understand if they were warnings, threats, or a twisted way of leading me to something bigger. One night, As I was going through the documents on my desk again, I noticed that there was a pattern in the dates of the disappearances. They all coincided with the approval of specific contracts between the government and the security company. The operations described were vague, with terms such as risk containment or handling sensitive information. However, the real breaking point came when I found the name of a politician who was currently at the center of a national controversy, Senator Alarcón. According to the documents, he was one of the main promoters of the contracts, and the people who had disappeared were linked to investigations into his activities. That revelation was enough for me to know that I was in danger. From that moment on, my movements began to be more calculated. I changed my daily routes, stopped using my personal phone, and started working from public cafes instead of my apartment. But even with all those precautions, the signs that I was being followed didn't go away. First, it was the cars. A gray sedan started showing up too often near my building. Then, as I walked down the street, I would notice the same people turning corners or adjusting their headphones as they seemed to follow me. One night, as I was heading home, I saw two men in dark suits standing under a streetlight, seemingly motionless in the rain. They didn't seem lost or waiting for anyone. They just stood there, like figures keeping watch. The climax came a week later, when I decided to get closer to the source. One of the documents contained an address on the outskirts of the city, an office complex belonging to the security company. I arrived at the site at dusk, under a storm that seemed to be tearing the sky apart. I parked at a safe distance and observed the building. It was inconspicuous, with no visible signage, but I noticed cameras on every corner and an electrified perimeter fence. From my position, I saw black vans with no license plates going in and out of the building. I decided to move closer, taking advantage of the darkness and the noise of the rain to cover my movements. I circled the building and found a blind spot on the cameras. From there, I managed to take pictures of the vehicles and the interior through a window. What I saw confirmed my worst suspicions. Maps marked with strategic routes, boxes with official stamps, and most shockingly, a corkboard with photographs of several people. Among those photos was mine. My heart stopped. There was no doubt that they already knew who I was and that I was being watched. I got out of there as fast as I could, aware that my time was running out. Later that night, when I arrived at my apartment, I found the door ajar. Something in me told me not to go in, that it was no longer safe, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside, everything was in disarray. My papers, my computer, even my clothes. Everything had been searched. On my desk was a message written on a white piece of paper: "Stop digging or you will be buried." It was then that I understood that there was no turning back. I couldn't go to the police. I knew someone inside the system was involved. I decided to go to a trusted contact at the newspaper, someone with experience in sensitive cases. I gave him copies of the documents and photographs I had taken, making sure the information was safe in case something happened to me. That same night, I left my apartment and took refuge in a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city. The rain did not stop, as if the sky wanted to erase any trace of what was happening. From my window, I watched the few cars passing by on the road, wondering if any of them were there for me. The next few days were a game of survival. I moved constantly, changing places every night and avoiding any contact with acquaintances. But no matter how hard I tried to hide, I always felt I was being watched. My paranoia grew to the point that every shadow on the street, every lingering glance, made my heart skip a beat. Finally, one night, while trying to sleep in a dark, dank room, I heard footsteps in the hallway. They stopped outside my door. I held my breath, feeling fear paralyze me. The door didn't open, but after a few seconds, I saw an envelope slid underneath. Inside, I found a photograph of me taken that same night, looking out the window. I don't know how I escaped from them that time. Maybe they were toying with me. Maybe they wanted me to feel the weight of their power before they struck the final blow. But that photograph was the last warning I needed. I knew my only option was to expose everything before it was too late. I went back to the newspaper and published the story with all the documents, the names, the evidence. The conspiracy came to light. And although some powerful people were implicated, others managed to deflect attention and get away unscathed. I knew it wouldn't be enough to bring down the whole system, but at least I had shed light on the darkness. Now I live far away, in a place where the rain is not as frequent and the faces are unfamiliar. But even here, thousands of miles away, I feel that I am not alone. I know that I am still being watched, that the shadows have not completely vanished. There is no victory in a fight against absolute power, only small triumphs that allow you to survive another day. And every time it rains, I remember that photograph and the message that was engraved in my mind. Silence is not an option, but speaking has a price. I paid mine, and I'm still paying it. I have always been a man of certainties. I built my company from scratch, faced economic crises, ruthless competitors, and long years of tireless work. My success was the result of iron discipline and obsessive attention to detail. My routine was relentless. Arrive at the office before everyone else, review every report with a magnifying glass, and never leave anything to chance. Until that day. It was an overcast autumn morning, and the rain was beginning to drum against the windows of my 24th floor office. As I was reviewing contracts, my assistant came in with a small box wrapped in brown paper. It had no return address or visible markings, just my name handwritten in black ink. It was unusual, but not altogether strange. I often received gifts or samples from clients and partners. However, this box had something different about it, a feeling I couldn't identify, as if it carried an invisible weight. I opened it with curiosity and found a simple object, a black pocket watch, antique, with a sober but impeccable design. Next to it, a small folded piece of paper with a brief message, "Time reveals all." There was no signature or other details. For a moment, I thought it was an elaborate joke, perhaps from some colleague with a twisted sense of humor, but something about the precision of the message and the absence of context made me uncomfortable. The clock was not working. Its hands were stopped at 12 past 10. I left the object on my desk, trying to concentrate on my work, but my mind kept returning to the box. That night, as I was checking my schedule for the next day, I noticed that the message on the paper had followed me like a persistent echo. The next day, things began to change. A sense of constant vigilance settled into my life. During a meeting with my team, I noticed furtive glances among my employees, as if they knew something I was unaware of. Their answers seemed measured, their expressions tense. I began to doubt everything, their intentions, their words, even their silences. My paranoia grew when I received a second package. This time the courier left it directly at the reception desk, addressed to my name, but with no further details. Inside was a sheet of paper with a list of names. They were people close to me, my assistant, my CFO, my senior partner, and several key employees. At the bottom of the list, my own name. There was no explanation, just that disturbing order. The clock on the first box also seemed to have moved forward. Its hands now read 13 past 10. The effect was immediate. Every interaction with the people on the list began to be tinged with suspicion. Why were they there? What did their relationship to me mean? My days became an exercise in constant vigilance, looking for signs of betrayal or conspiracy. I analyzed every word, every gesture. The rain that fell relentlessly over the city seemed to intensify my isolation, locking me in my office, where the box and the clock kept reminding me that something was coming. One night, while checking the building access logs, I discovered something alarming. My office had been opened after hours, a day after I received the first box. The system was not recording who had entered, just an anomaly in the schedules. I asked the security team, but got no clear answers. Their evasive attitudes only fueled my paranoia. I decided to take extreme measures. I installed hidden cameras in my office and in the nearby corridors, convinced that someone was playing games with me. I wanted proof, something that would help me identify my enemy. Meanwhile, the pocket watch ticked slowly. Each day, the hands seemed to move a few minutes more. When it struck 12 past 10, I received another package. This time, the contents were more disturbing. An envelope full of photographs, They showed me, captured at different times of the day. Walking to the building, having lunch at a nearby restaurant, even inside my own home. They were not images taken from afar. They seemed to be taken from angles that only someone close to me could have. Next to the photographs was a message that read, "Time does not give extension." It was then that I began to doubt everyone. My assistant, my partner, even the building security guards. Every person who interacted with me seemed to be a potential threat. I began to work in lockdown, avoiding unnecessary contact, and checking every corner of my office before I sat down. The rain continued to fall, relentless, as if the outside world was diluting into an oppressive gray. One night, as I was reviewing the recordings from the cameras I had installed, I saw something that chilled my blood. A hooded figure entering my office. He moved confidently, as if he knew exactly where to look. He rummaged through my desk drawers, stopped in front of the pocket watch, and then left another package on the table before disappearing. When I went to check, I found the package, identical to the previous ones. Inside was a key and an address written on crumpled paper. The address led to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Against all instinct, I decided to go. I wanted answers. I needed to know who was behind this and why. I arrived at the place one dark night, with the rain pounding on the roof of the car like a drum. The warehouse was empty, cold, and smelled musty. Upon entering, I found a desk with a single object, a file with my name on it. Inside the file were documents detailing my entire life, from my early years in college to the most recent financial movements of my company. Every transaction, every relationship, every decision was there, accurately documented. There were also letters and emails I had never written, with my forged signature, and contracts I didn't recognize. It was as if someone had constructed an alternate version of my life, one I couldn't control. On the last document, a warning. Time is running out. I looked at my pocket watch, which now read 10:30. That night I understood that it was not a game or a simple threat. Someone wanted to destroy me, but not in a direct way. They were eroding my confidence, my sanity, and my perception of reality. I didn't know who I could trust, and with each passing day, I was drifting further away from the certainties I had built up my whole life. I returned to my office determined to confront whoever was behind it all. But when I arrived, I found my space empty. My files were gone. My computer had been replaced by a new and unfamiliar machine, and my employees looked at me as if they didn't recognize me. My name was no longer on the nameplate on the door. My world had vanished, replaced by something I could not comprehend. The rain was still falling, and on my empty desk, only one object remained: the pocket watch. Its hands had reached 10:31, and then I understood that there was no time left. I have always considered myself an explorer of the forgotten. In the world of independent cinema, most people seek to innovate, to break the mold, but I became obsessed with the old, with what time seemed to have buried. My passion was the lost films, those that the world discarded or left aside, and my goal was to give them back their place. It was that obsession that led me to find a film I should never have discovered. It all started at a film antiques fair. It was a gray day, and the rain was falling in thin curtains, drawing patterns on the windows of the buildings. I was browsing the stalls in search of forgotten rolls of film when a vendor offered me something peculiar: a worn wooden box containing a reel of black and white celluloid. It had no labels, no director's name, just a title engraved on a rusty piece of metal: The Eternal Gaze. The film looked deteriorated by time, but intact in essence. According to the seller, it belonged to a director from the 50s, a certain Émile Duval, whose name I did not immediately recognize. I did some research on it and discovered that Duval had been an experimental filmmaker who mysteriously disappeared after the production of his last film, which was never released. The few mentions of him described him as an obsessive visionary with a dark and disturbing style. I took the reel to my small studio, a modest space where I worked on restorations and personal projects. As the rain pounded the roof harder, I set up the projector and carefully loaded the film. The tape was more intact than I expected, as if it had been deliberately preserved, protected from the passage of time. When I turned on the projector, the room was filled with the familiar hum of the motor and the flicker of light on the screen. The film began simply: a man walking through an empty desert, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The image was hypnotic, almost unreal. The framing was full of disturbing symmetries, and the cuts were abrupt, as if each scene sought to disconcert the viewer. There was a narrative, but it was not linear. Fragments of conversations, prolonged glances, and in the background, a faint, barely audible music, like a constant hum that seemed to resonate more in my mind than in my ears. At first, I didn't notice the disturbing details. It was only after screening the film several times, seeking to restore the colors and sound, that I began to notice patterns. There were images interspersed between the main frames, barely perceptible, that seemed to last only a fraction of a second. It was as if the film was hiding something that was not meant to be consciously seen. I became obsessed with those images. I paused them, analyzed them, enlarged them. They showed human faces deformed by fear, scenes of suggestive violence in places I could not identify. What disturbed me most was that these images did not seem to be part of a fiction. They were too real, too raw. It seemed that Duvall had created not just a film, but an experience designed to discomfort, to invade the mind of the viewer. The more I studied the film, the more I began to feel its effects on me. I slept badly, tormented by nightmares in which the faces of the images appeared, motionless, staring at me from the darkness. The background music, that persistent drone, kept playing in my head, even when I wasn't watching the movie. My friends and colleagues noticed my change in behavior, but I couldn't explain to them what was happening. No one would understand, I thought. It was my problem. I decided to share the film with a small group of filmmakers and critics at a private screening. I wanted opinions. I wanted to confirm that what I was feeling was not a hallucination of mine. Organizing the event was simple. Gathering a small group of curious viewers was not complicated, and the screening was held in an independent movie theater I knew well. But what happened that night convinced me that I had made a serious mistake. The attendees arrived with enthusiasm, but by the end of the screening, the mood was somber. No one spoke. Their gazes were empty, as if the film had drained something from them. One of the more experienced critics rose from his seat, trembling, and left without saying goodbye. Another, a close colleague, told me that the film should not be seen by anyone else, that what Duvall had created was more than a work of art. It was a weapon, a device designed to manipulate the mind. After the screening, I began to notice an even more disturbing pattern. People who had attended the event began to disappear from my life. Some stopped answering my calls. Others quit their jobs without warning. One of them, I heard, was committed to a psychiatric hospital after a suicide attempt. I felt responsible, but I didn't know what to do. The film seemed to have a corrosive effect on the psyche of those who watched it. Then the messages started. Emails from unknown senders, texts on my phone from blocked numbers. They were warnings, veiled threats telling me to stop researching, to destroy the film. At first, I thought they were jokes in bad taste, but soon they began to feel more personal. Someone was watching me. One night, I found my studio door forced open. Nothing had been stolen, but the box containing the reel was open, as if someone had tried to take it and then changed their mind. I couldn't trust anyone, not even myself. Paranoia began to take hold of me, and every shadow in the night felt like a threat. I knew the film contained something that someone didn't want the world to see, but I didn't understand why. What was it that made the eternal stare so dangerous? Who was behind those messages and warnings? One day, in the midst of my despair, I found a document hidden among the files I had collected on Duvall. It was a kind of diary, where the director explained his purpose in creating the film. According to him, it was not a work of art, but an experiment designed to explore the limits of human suggestion. Every image, every sound, was calibrated to generate a specific emotional response, to manipulate the viewer's perception. Duvall had worked with psychologists and propaganda experts to perfect his technique. The film was not just a story, it was a mechanism to break the will. I understood then that I could not allow the film to fall into the wrong hands. I had seen enough to know that its impact was real and devastating. I decided to destroy it, but before I did, I wanted to leave a record, a warning for those who might encounter it in the future. I wrote down everything I knew, everything I had experienced, and kept the reel in a safe place while I planned how to dispose of it. The night I tried to destroy it, the rain was coming down harder than ever, as if the world itself was trying to stop me. I headed for an old incinerator on the outskirts of town, carrying the wooden box with the reel inside. But when I arrived, I found someone waiting for me. I didn't recognize him, but his presence was intimidating. I was not alone. There were others, silent, watching me from the shadows. His message was clear. I was not to destroy the film. That was the last time I saw the eternal gaze. They forced me to turn it in and warned me to forget everything I knew. Since then, I have lived with the weight of what I discovered, with the certainty that, somewhere, someone is using that film for a purpose more sinister than I can imagine. The rain keeps falling in my nightmares, and every time I close my eyes, I see those faces, that eternal gaze that I can never forget. Forensic photography was never what I imagined. When I started in this field, I thought it would simply be a matter of capturing the scene as I found it. The bodies, the footprints, the traces, all laid out before me like a puzzle that someone else would solve. What I didn't anticipate was how those seemingly neutral images could begin to speak to me, whispering dark secrets I never wanted to hear. I have always been meticulous with my work. The light, the angle, the exposure, everything has to be perfect. But there was one night, on a particularly gruesome scene, when I noticed something I couldn't let go of. I was photographing a routine case, a murder in a suburban neighborhood, a woman's body found in a dark alley, her face unhinged in an expression of horror. But what caught my attention was not the corpse or the evidence of the crime. It was a slight distortion in the shot, an almost imperceptible shape in the background of one of the photos, which was not there at the time of capture. A small detail, something out of place. The detail went unnoticed by everyone. The case was quickly closed as an opportunistic crime, the perpetrator arrested. But something at that moment disturbed me deeply. I started going through all the crime scene photographs I had taken over the past few months, looking for that pattern. I didn't mention it to anyone, of course. Detectives and police often underestimate the work of forensics, and I didn't want to be seen as paranoid. However, what I found made me change the way I viewed my work and, perhaps, my own life. Every time I developed a new series of photographs, something jumped out at me. A shadow, a strange object, a small reflection that didn't belong in the scene. At first, I thought it might be some mistake with the camera, an optical aberration or a problem with the equipment. But as the images accumulated, I realized it was more than that. There was a pattern. Something was in every photo, and that something seemed to be watching me. The first suspicious case was of a man found in his apartment, apparently dead from suicide. But the photo of his body, just before it was removed, showed something that could not be ignored. A figure in the background, barely visible, looking down at the corpse from the corner of the room. It was no more than a flash of light, a human form, but it was sufficiently defined to be unsettling. It did not appear in the first few shots, only in the one I took after the initial inspection. At first I doubted my own perception. I was obsessed, wasn't I? But the next case was even stranger. A victim in a park, his body mutilated and left beside a pond. As I reviewed the photos, I saw the same figure in the background, this time closer to the victim, almost as if it was awaiting his arrival. It was hard to define, but it was there, undeniably present. It was then that I began to look for more specific patterns. I studied the dates of the crimes, the locations, the conditions under which the photos were taken. The murders didn't seem to follow a coherent timeline, but the figure did. He was always in the background, always in a corner, always watching, as if waiting for something. Sometimes he disappeared, sometimes he approached the victim, but it was never absent. One day, after reviewing one more series of photos, I understood. What I was seeing was not an accident or an anomaly. There was a serial killer who had been operating for decades, and he was in every one of my jobs. He wasn't just a random figure who showed up in photos. He was someone who was fully involved in the crimes. Maybe he was even orchestrating them. The evidence was clear, but no one else was seeing it. I knew I had something valuable in my hands, but I also knew that if I shared it with anyone, I risked being labeled crazy. This killer had a special ability to move in the shadows, to infiltrate every scene and become part of the narrative, unseen and unrecognized. He was a specter, but not a ghost. He was human, real. Weeks passed, and my obsession with the photos grew. I began to dig deeper into each crime, each victim. In every case, there was something in common, a pattern that was not only visible in the photographs, but also in the details of the scene. The victims had something in common that was not obvious to the naked eye. They had all been involved in some kind of incident or complaint related to organized crime, though never directly. All the crimes had occurred in specific locations, remote areas, old buildings, areas with little surveillance. I decided to take the risk and take my finding to a trusted detective. I was nervous, but I knew I couldn't handle this alone. When I showed him the photographs, his eyes grew wide as he saw the same shadows, the same fuzzy figures. He didn't tell me anything right away, but the look on his face was enough. It was a silent recognition. Finally, he admitted that he had noticed something strange about the crimes, but had failed to make any connection until that moment. Together, we began to track the crimes and the figures. The more we investigated, the more we realized that this killer had not only been operating for years, but had deliberately manipulated the evidence so that he would never be discovered. It all fit into a well-thought-out pattern, but the key was in the photographs. The killer had learned to operate in the shadows, to leave his mark without leaving physical evidence. As we got closer to the truth, strange things began to happen. I received anonymous emails with photos similar to the ones I had taken, but no message. My car was stopped by the police for a traffic violation, and when they checked the paperwork, they found that someone had been making meticulous records of my movements. Paranoia set in, but I could no longer turn back. The clues eventually led us to a small town on the outskirts of the city, where a series of crimes had never been solved, and where the killer's trail seemed to have vanished. However, upon reviewing old files, we discovered that all the victims in that town had something in common. They were people who had interacted in some way with a human trafficking network, unbeknownst to anyone. Eventually, we were able to track the killer to an abandoned mansion, where we found the remains of several victims and a room full of photographs, just like the ones he had been taking. But there was something else. The killer had been photographing the victims before their deaths, and the images were almost identical to the ones I had taken. The figure in the background was his signature, his way of being present, of making sure that his crimes would never be left out of history. What began as a series of simple photographs became the darkest puzzle of my career. Thanks to those images, the killer was finally caught. His name never came to light because his network of contacts was far more widespread than we could have imagined. But at least the victims got justice, and the killer was dismantled. The fear, however, did not disappear, because now I knew that there are much deeper shadows than I had ever imagined. I had been a detective all my working life, but now, retired and cloistered in this small office, only the echoes of old investigations, of unsolved cases, of lost years remained. The city was no longer what it used to be, let alone the police force. Corruption was always present, in some form, but I never imagined the network was so deep. I, Henry Johnson, had worked as a detective in the homicide unit for over 30 years. I can say, without false modesty, that I solved more cases than most could count in their entire career. However, there was one that I could never solve. A case that haunts me to this day. A case that was closed, but never solved. The disappearance of Estefania Thompson, a young woman of 24, a college student who, according to initial reports, had disappeared without a trace. No one had seen her. No one had heard anything. She simply vanished one autumn afternoon. After months of investigations, to no avail, the case was closed. But Estefania never stopped haunting me. I felt her like a shadow in my life, lurking from the darkest corners of my mind, always pushing me to find out what really happened. I knew there was more to it, that not everything fit. The way the investigation faded, as if someone was covering something up, disturbed me deeply. But at the time, my voice was silenced, like so many others at the time. I had retired from the police almost 2 years ago. I was living off my savings and what little was left of my pension, spending my days in solitude, locked in this small, dank office, surrounded by old papers and memories of past cases. I thought that maybe life would finally leave me alone, that I had nothing more to worry about. But that night, the storm began to rage, and something in my office made me look up. A package was on my desk, right in front of me. I hadn't heard it come in, and I hadn't seen anyone come in. My first instinct was that it was a mistake, but something inside me told me it wasn't. The package had no return address or return address. The package had no return address or return address, just a broken wax seal with a strange insignia that I didn't recognize. I took it in my hands cautiously, as if it were a bomb, but curiosity overcame my prudence. I opened it slowly. Inside there was a worn leather folder, and when I opened it, I found a series of photographs. The images were blurry, dark, taken from a considerable distance, but what caught my attention was one in particular. It was a photo of Estefania Thompson. It was not a stock photo, but a recent image. Her face, though blurry, looked familiar. Somehow, her gaze seemed to say something I had never been able to decipher. He was standing on a street in the distance, but there was something about his pose that made me uncomfortable. It wasn't a photo taken by a journalist. It wasn't an image captured by accident. There was someone who had been watching her. Someone who had followed her to that point. Next to the photo was a series of documents. They were excerpts from reports of the investigation I had conducted at the time. But the strange thing, what really made my blood run cold, was that there was something else, something I had never seen before. On one of the pages, it clearly indicated the involvement of several police officers, colleagues of mine at the time, in Estefania's disappearance. How could that be possible? My mind could not process it. There was forensic work, witness testimony, and, most disturbing, a list of names. Names of officers, of people who had once been involved in the investigation. They all seemed to be connected in some way, but the web was far more complex than I could have imagined. My breathing quickened. The package, with everything it contained, was evidence that Stephanie Thompson was never an ordinary disappearance. The young woman had fallen into a web of corruption, a web that involved the very men once sworn to protect her. There was no doubt. Someone within the police had been behind her disappearance, and now, nearly 2 decades later, it was being exposed. The rain continued its violent hammering on the glass. I felt the temperature in the room drop suddenly, and my mind filled with questions I didn't want to answer. Who had sent the package, and why now? The truth had always haunted me, but now, for the first time, I had the pieces to discover what had really happened. However, I also knew I couldn't do it alone. These men, these officers, were not simply corrupt. They were part of a much larger, much more dangerous network. If what was in that package was true, I was on the verge of something much bigger than a cold case. The night passed quickly, or so it seemed to me. I couldn't take my eyes off the documents, the photos, the names. Everything seemed to fit, but at the same time it was all distorted by a haze of confusion. I didn't know who had left the package in my office, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I felt I could trust no one, not even those who were once my colleagues. I was caught in a web of lies and corruption, and the closer I got to the truth, the more dangerous the path became. I decided to act. I could not stand idly by while the truth came out, even if it meant putting myself in danger. I started investigating, contacting old informants and revisiting old cases, those I thought were forgotten. The deeper I dug, the more connections I found, the more names emerged. The corruption was not limited to a couple of dishonest officers. It was a network that extended throughout the entire police force, and worst of all, it had never been uncovered. The storm raged even more fiercely that night, and in my mind, echoed the words written in one of the reports. They are protecting their own interests, and they will not stop until everyone who knows the truth is silenced. It was then that I understood that my life was at stake. Those men, those officers, would do whatever it took to keep their secrets buried, and I was the only person who knew enough to expose them. The network I had been operating for years was beginning to crumble, and what seemed to be the last case of my career was becoming the most dangerous of all my investigations. Every step I took brought me closer to a truth far darker than I had imagined. Corruption within law enforcement was not just a matter of theories. It was a palpable reality, a reality that had affected the lives of so many people and was now dragging me toward its epicenter. What I didn't know was that in trying to unearth the truth, I had already awakened something I should never have touched. The truth, while liberating, can also be a condemnation, and now I was on the verge of losing everything. My life, my memories, my safety, everything was at stake, because I had touched the heart of the darkness that the police had been protecting for so many years. And as the rain continued to fall, I couldn't help but wonder, how many times had I been close to the truth and hadn't seen it? And how many more should I find out before it was too late?